Some of the most unsettling stories are not about what we know happened, but about what we can't explain. They're the stories that take place in the vast, quiet wilderness, where a person can be there 1 second and gone the next. We're not talking about simple cases of getting lost. We're talking about disappearances that defy all logic, where children are found miles away in impossible terrain with no memory of how they got there, and adults return with tales so strange they sound like they're from another world. Today, we're going to look at 3 cases from the deep woods of Arkansas, each one a puzzle with missing pieces that leave a chilling, permanent question mark. These are stories that make you wonder what really is out there just beyond the edge of the trail. On the morning of the 16th of June, 1946, the Van Alst family pulled up to a rented cabin in Devil's Den State Park in western Arkansas. It was the start of what was supposed to be a perfect summer week. The father, his 8-year-old daughter Catherine, and her 2 older brothers were all excited to get their vacation started. After they finished unpacking their bags and getting settled in, the first thing on the agenda was to go for a swim. The father led the kids down a well-worn path to the local swimming area. It was a picturesque spot, a creek that widened and deepened as it flowed up against the side of a man-made dam. The sun was out, other families were around, and the sound of kids laughing and splashing filled the air. As soon as they got there, Catherine and her 2 brothers couldn't wait. They kicked off their shoes and jumped right into the cool water. They started playing games, splashing each other, and joining in with some of the other children who were already there. Their father found a comfortable spot on the bank, a place where he could keep an eye on all 3 of them, and he just sat back to watch them have fun. Now, this swimming area was generally safe, but there was one particular section everyone knew to be careful of. Right up against the concrete wall of the dam, the water got very deep very quickly. It was an area that the stronger, more confident swimmers enjoyed, but parents made sure to tell the younger kids to stay in the shallower parts. Catherine was only 8, and she wasn't a particularly strong swimmer. She was mostly splashing around where her feet could touch the bottom. But at one point, as she was playing, she started to drift. Without even realizing it, she had floated over into the deep section right next to the dam. Her father, who was watching her brothers for a moment, didn't see it happen. Her brothers, caught up in their own game, didn't notice either. But there was someone else there, a woman who was also visiting the campground. She didn't know the Van Alst family, but she happened to be standing near the edge of the water, and she saw what was happening. She saw little Catherine start to struggle, her head bobbing beneath the surface. Without a second of hesitation, the woman reached into the water and pulled Catherine out, setting her back on her feet on solid ground. Catherine was sputtering a bit, but she was perfectly fine. The woman knelt down and spoke to her calmly. She said, "You really need to be more careful. You shouldn't be swimming in the deep end if you're not a strong swimmer." Catherine nodded, a little scared, but okay, and said she understood. Just then, Catherine's father heard their voices. He looked over and saw his daughter, who he thought was safely in the shallow water, talking to a complete stranger. His parental instincts immediately kicked in. He made a sound to get their attention and waved in their direction, trying to signal to the woman, "What are you doing talking to my daughter?" The woman looked up and saw the concern on his face. She must have been a mother herself, because she immediately understood. She smiled reassuringly and called out to him. She said, "Oh no, everything is totally fine. I was just helping your daughter out of the water. She's okay, everything is fine." Hearing this, Catherine's father turned his attention to his daughter. He said, "Hey, you have to be more careful. Don't go in the deep end." And Catherine, still a little shaken, just said, "Okay, Dad." Instead of getting back in the water, Catherine decided to do something else. She walked over to the backside of the dam. This wasn't a dangerous, steep drop-off like you might imagine. The outflow side of this particular dam was a gradual slope made of huge weathered boulders. It was a popular spot for the kids at the campground to climb and explore. They treated it like a natural jungle gym, and their parents could easily watch them from the swimming area. So, Catherine started scrambling over the big rocks, and her father settled back into his routine of watching his kids. He'd look over at his two sons who were still in the water, and then he'd glance over to the dam and see Catherine climbing on the rocks. He kept going back and forth, making sure he had eyes on all three of them. It was just a few seconds at a time. A glance at the boys, a glance at Catherine. A glance at the boys, a glance at Catherine. But then, at one point, he looked at his sons in the water, and when he looked back to where Catherine was on the rocks, she was just gone. He stood up straight, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He walked over to the edge of the dam, thinking maybe she had just climbed all the way to the bottom and was out of his line of sight. Maybe she was crouched down behind one of the big boulders. But when he got to the edge and looked all the way down the slope of rocks, she wasn't there. He scanned the entire area, left and right. Nothing. He started to feel a real sense of panic. This is impossible, he thought to himself. I just saw her on those rocks. It was literally seconds ago. Where could she have gone? He turned back to his sons, who were still splashing around in the creek, and he yelled, "Hey, have you seen Catherine?" They both shook their heads and said no, they hadn't seen her. He then looked for the woman who had helped Catherine out of the water earlier. He found her and quickly walked over. He asked her, "Have you seen my daughter?" The woman looked concerned and said, "No, the last I saw her, she was playing on the rocks. I don't know where she went." Before long, Catherine's father was screaming her name. His voice was raw with fear, echoing through the park. His panic was contagious. He quickly enlisted the help of everybody at the campground who was nearby. People immediately dropped what they were doing to help look for his daughter. Complete strangers were jumping into the swimming area above the dam, feeling around in the murky water. Other people were searching the creek bed below the dam. Every bush, every cluster of trees, the entire area was being searched by this impromptu group of concerned campers. But there was absolutely no sign of the little girl. After about an hour of this frantic, fruitless searching, Catherine's father knew he needed more help. He ran to find a park ranger and got the police involved. The search that followed was massive. For 2 full days, search and rescue teams, police officers, and volunteers scoured the incredibly thick forest that surrounded the dam. They searched day and night, but they found no trace of Catherine. Not a footprint, not a piece of her clothing, nothing. Authorities started to reconsider their initial assumptions. They decided it was far more likely that she had somehow fallen back into the water and drowned, either above or below the dam, than it was that she had just wandered off into the dense woods. It just made more sense, given where she was last seen. And so, they shifted the focus of the entire operation. They brought in equipment and began the long process of draining the 2 large sections of water, the swimming hole above the dam and the creek pool below it. Everyone held their breath, preparing for the worst, expecting that as the water level dropped, they would find her body at the bottom. But when both sections were completely drained, there was nothing there. She wasn't in the water. This was a devastating blow. It meant that she had to be somewhere in the miles and miles of unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. So, once again, the search parties went back into the forest, their hopes dwindling with each passing hour. On June 22nd, 6 full days after Catherine had vanished from the rocks on the dam, a small group of searchers was pushing through the woods. They were a long, long way from where the search had started. They were 7 miles deep into the forest as the crow flies, slowly making their way up the side of a steep mountain. They were exhausted, but they kept going, yelling Catherine's name into the dense trees. As they were walking, they suddenly stopped. Ahead of them, a small figure had just walked out of the mouth of a cave. It was a little girl, and she was wearing only a bathing suit. She looked down the mountainside at the group of stunned men, and in a perfectly calm voice, she just said, "Here I am." The searchers couldn't believe their eyes. It was Catherine. They rushed up the mountain to her. Besides a few scratches on her arms and some bug bites on her legs, she seemed to be perfectly fine. In fact, the men who found her would later say that she was eerily calm. It was like she was just waking up from a long dream, not like a child who had been lost and alone in the wilderness for nearly a week. She was soon reunited with her family, who were overwhelmed with relief and disbelief. They couldn't believe she was still alive after all this time. They immediately brought her to a hospital where doctors gave her a thorough examination. And their conclusion was just as baffling. They confirmed what the searchers had seen. Besides some superficial cuts and a few bug bites, she was physically fine. 2 days later, she was discharged from the hospital, as if nothing had happened. Let's just take a moment to really understand how impossible this is. This was an 8-year-old girl who had never spent any real time in the woods before. This trip to Devil's Den State Park was her first real exposure to that kind of environment. And somehow, she had survived on her own, out in the wild, for 6 days and 6 nights with nothing but a bathing suit on. What's even more incredible is that in the remote mountainous area where she was found, there were no known sources of fresh, potable water anywhere nearby. Yet, when the doctors examined her, she was determined to be relatively well hydrated. And she had only lost a couple of pounds. Then, there's the staggering distance she covered. While she was found 7 miles away from where she went missing, that's a straight line on a map. When you're in the wild, you don't walk in perfectly straight lines. There are too many obstructions. There are mountains to climb, ravines to cross, thickets of trees and brush to get around. You end up zigging and zagging constantly. Search and rescue experts analyzed the terrain and estimated that the minimum real distance she would have had to travel to get from the dam to that cave was about 30 miles. And she did it all barefoot. Catherine's survival defied every established search and rescue model for an 8-year-old child lost in the wild. She was found in a location so far outside the standard search boundaries that nobody would have ever expected to find her there. Basically, by all logical accounts, she should have died. When authorities gently questioned her, trying to piece together what had happened, her answers only made the mystery deeper. They asked her, "How did you do this? How did you survive?" And she just looked at them and said, "I don't know." She said she had no memory of how she got lost in the first place. Her only clear memory from that first day was falling asleep on a patch of warm grass. Her very next memory was waking up inside that cave on day 6, just before the searchers found her. She had no idea what happened in the 5 days in between. She had no idea how she traveled 30 miles, how she found water, or how she found food. Some people tried to rationalize it. They said, maybe this is just a really, really weird case where she got incredibly lucky. But others have a darker theory. They think that something in the forest must have chased her. That pure adrenaline kicked in, forcing her to run those 30 miles to the safety of that cave. And because the experience was so deeply traumatic, her mind simply erased the memory to protect itself. But like with so many of these stories, what we're left with are a lot more questions than answers. Fast forward a few decades to the 29th of April 2001, a 6-year-old girl named Haley Zaga was on a hike with her grandparents. They were in a very rural part of Arkansas called the Upper Buffalo Wilderness Area. Now, for an area to be officially designated as a wilderness area, it means that no vehicles of any kind are allowed to come through there. That makes it incredibly remote, incredibly quiet, and incredibly wild. Haley and her grandparents had taken a trail that led them up to the top of a high bluff, about 200 feet higher than where they had started their hike. When they got to the top, the view was breathtaking. They stood at an incredible overlook, looking down over a winding river and a valley of green trees. At about 11 in the morning, after taking in the view, they turned around to start the trip back down. By about 11:30, they were making their way down the trail when Haley spotted something off to the side of the path. It was a waterfall cascading down the rocks. She got really excited and immediately wanted to go see it up close. She asked her grandparents, "Can we please go check out that waterfall?" Her grandparents looked over and sized up the situation. It seemed like the only way they could actually get down to the base of the waterfall would be by literally climbing down a tree and descending over the edge of a small cliff. It was a route that the grandparents just did not feel comfortable letting their 6-year-old granddaughter attempt. And so they had to tell her no. They said, "Haley, we need to keep going. We're not going to go check out that waterfall." Haley, being a determined 6-year-old, really wanted to see it, and she wasn't happy about being told no. She wanted to get her way, so she threw a little tantrum. She sat right down in the middle of the trail, crossed her arms, and said, "Well, if you're not going to take me to the waterfall, then I'm not going to move. You're going to have to carry me." Her grandparents sighed. They said, "No, we're not going to carry you. You need to be a big girl. We need you to stand up and start walking with us." But Haley refused to budge. So her grandparents decided to try a different tactic. They said, "Okay, we're going to leave you here then." And they turned around and they kept walking down the trail. They didn't go far at all. They were still completely in her view, and it was broad daylight. They would walk a few feet and then turn around, fully expecting their granddaughter to give up, stand up, and start begrudgingly walking after them. And after a moment, she did. Haley stood up and called out, "Okay, wait for me." And she started walking. Her grandparents were relieved and said, "All right, let's go." So they started walking ahead of Haley. But as they walked, Haley started to slow down more and more and more. Her grandparents could tell she was doing it on purpose. She was still upset, and she was trying to be frustrating, intentionally taking as long as she possibly could. But her grandparents were patient. They made sure they always kept her in their view. They would walk a little ways, then turn around, and she'd be right there behind them. They'd walk a little further, turn around, and she'd still be there. They did this over and over again. And then, at some point, they walked a few steps, turned around to check on her, and she wasn't there. The grandparents' hearts dropped. They immediately ran back up the trail, looking around for Haley. Their first thought was that she had probably just darted behind a tree to hide, just to be a little more frustrating and continue her game. So, at first, they weren't that worried. They started looking behind the biggest trees and rocks, calling out for her. They said, "Come on, we really have to leave. You have to come out now, we have to go." But there was no answer from Haley. All they heard was the sound of the wind in the trees. It was just silence. She was just totally gone. For the next 90 minutes, the grandparents ran frantically up and down that stretch of trail, screaming for Haley. They searched everywhere they could think of, but they never found her. Finally, in a state of pure panic, they ran all the way down the mountain and called the police. What followed was the largest search and rescue mission in the history of the state of Arkansas. It was an enormous operation launched for one little girl, Haley Zaga. It included hundreds of searchers on the ground, covering every inch of the rugged terrain. There were 8 different canine dog teams brought in to try and pick up her scent. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the wilderness from the air. There were firefighters, local police, and even the National Guard was called in to help. But after 2 full days of this incredible, exhaustive search, really no progress had been made. The only potential clue they had found came from one of the dog teams. The dogs had tracked Haley's scent from where she was last seen on the trail all the way up to a nearby road. And at the edge of the road, the dogs just stopped. The scent was gone. Unfortunately, what that usually tells investigators is a very grim story. It looked like Haley had been picked up by someone in a car. But then, 51 hours into the ordeal, something incredible happened. There were 2 searchers who were working well outside of the primary search area. They were about 2 miles away from the spot where she had gone missing, in an area that hadn't been a high priority. As they were walking along a creek, they spotted her. She was just sitting there next to a small brook with her feet dangling in the cool water. When she saw the two men, she just kind of waved. They approached her cautiously, and one of them asked, "Are you Haley Zaga?" And she looked up at them and said, "Yeah." She had a couple of small scratches on her arm and on her face, but overall, she seemed to be okay. And just like that, Haley was reunited with her overjoyed family. She was then brought to a local hospital to be checked out and kept for observation. After Haley had rested and regained some of her strength, investigators sat down with her to ask her what had happened. Her story was strange. She said that she was walking behind her grandparents and that she just looked down at her feet for a second. But when she looked up again, not only were her grandparents gone, but the trail was gone too. She said she was suddenly looking at a solid wall of trees. She didn't know where she was or how she had gotten there. And since she was only 6 years old, her first instinct wasn't to stop and look around or to yell for help. Instead, she just kept walking deeper into the woods in a direction that she didn't recognize. She said she walked and walked and walked, but she never found the trail again. She told them that pretty soon it started to get dark, and she found a place to sleep on top of the bluff where she'd gone missing. Then, the next day, when the sun came up, she walked down from the bluff and eventually made it to the river. She then walked along the river until she found a small cave, and she slept there for the second night. And then, the next day, after she got up, she was found by the searchers. After she gave this explanation, the investigators had a lot of questions. One of the main ones was, if you were sleeping up on the bluff on that first night, then why couldn't the helicopters see you? The helicopters were flying over that bluff all night long. They were equipped with thermal imaging cameras that can easily pick up the heat signature of a person on the ground. They should have seen you. So they asked her, "Are you sure that's where you were?" And she nodded and said, "Yeah, that's where Alicia told me to stay." The investigators were confused. They asked, "Who's Alicia?" Haley answered matter-of-factly. She said, "Oh, she's my imaginary friend. I met her up on the bluff." Instantly, the investigators and Haley's parents all came to the same conclusion. Okay, she's clearly just coping with this very traumatic event by creating an imaginary friend to help her through it. It was a simple psychological defense mechanism. So they didn't ask any more questions about this imaginary friend. Instead, they continued to ask her practical questions about how she got from the place where she was lost to the place where she was found. They said, "Okay, Haley, how did you get down from the bluffs?" Because there's really only one safe way down, and the trail can be hard to find, especially if you're already off the path. And Haley said, "Well, Alicia brought me to a trail, and she led me down the bluffs. She stood right in front of me the whole way and made sure that I didn't fall forward." Hearing this, her parents and the investigators started to exchange glances. This was a lot more detailed than a typical imaginary friend story. If this person was physically right in front of her, propping her up, maybe this wasn't an imaginary friend after all. So they asked Haley, "Can you describe what Alicia looks like?" And Haley said, "Sure. She has black hair and brown eyes. She's a little bit shorter than me. She's 4 years old. She likes to tell jokes and she likes to sing songs." And then right there in the hospital room, Haley began singing some of the songs that she said she had learned from Alicia. She even started telling some of the jokes she had learned from Alicia. Even though Haley was giving this incredibly vivid description of this 4-year-old girl named Alicia who was running around on the bluffs with her, it just couldn't possibly be real. And so, Haley's parents and the investigators went back to their original theory. They decided to treat Alicia as just an imaginary friend, a simple coping mechanism for a scared little girl. The investigators finished up their interview with Haley, getting as much information as they could about her journey from the bluffs down to the river. And then, because Haley was physically fine, they said, "Okay, you're good to go." Haley's case was a really big deal in Arkansas. It was all over the local news, especially after she was found safe. Her hospital interview, where she mentioned her imaginary friend named Alicia, who had helped her get down the bluffs and had basically taken care of her, that part of the story was put into print in the newspapers. And after it was published, some local readers with long memories realized something chilling. They realized there was another little girl who had gone missing in the exact same spot as Haley 23 years earlier. That little girl had been 4 years old. She had black hair and brown eyes. Her name was Alana, and she had died on those bluffs. After this incredible connection was made, the story got national media attention. Suddenly, news outlets were suggesting that this imaginary friend wasn't imaginary at all. They were saying it was actually the spirit of Alana and that she had acted as Haley's guardian angel. In fact, Haley was even brought on the TV show Dateline to talk about her mysterious friend. Just this year, Haley, who is now 25 years old, posted a video to her own YouTube channel where she tells her side of the story of what happened over those 51 hours she was gone. And in the story, she talks about her imaginary friend. She says, before this happened, I never had an imaginary friend. And afterwards, I never had one again. But at that time, Alicia was very, very real to me. And I don't know who or what she was, but she saved my life. In September of 2012, a 53-year-old woman named Linda Ortega went to visit her brother, Eddie Huff, in St. Joe, Arkansas. St. Joe is another very rural part of the state, and it's located about a mile away from the Buffalo River National Park. This park is a huge expanse of thickly forested, mountainous land, and there are hundreds of small creeks, rivers, and ponds strewn throughout it. On Saturday, September 22nd, Linda and her brother Eddie decided to go for a walk in the park. Eddie had apparently heard from a friend about a great fishing spot hidden somewhere off the main trails, and he wanted to go try and find it. So, in their search for this specific spot, they stepped off of a marked trail and started making their way through the woods. It wasn't long before they realized they had gotten turned around. But it was still broad daylight and they weren't too worried. They figured, okay, we'll find the trail again soon. But as the hours passed and the sun started to set, they still had not found the trail. They had to face the fact that they were badly lost. And then, some very strange things started to happen. We only have a marginal understanding of the full sequence of events because of what came next. What we do know for sure is that the brother and sister were together on that first day they went missing. We know they were still together the following day, on Sunday, still wandering around looking for a way out of the park. And we know that by the end of that day, they were still lost. Then, on the next day, which was Monday, we know that the pair separated. Because on Monday, Eddie re-emerged from the park completely alone. He just walked out of the woods, hopped into his car like nothing unusual was going on, drove back to his house, and walked inside. His family, who had been frantic with worry, saw him and rushed over. They said, "Where have you been? You've been missing for 2 days. We've been calling you. Where have you been? And most importantly, where is Linda?" And Eddie just looked at them calmly and said, "Oh, everything's fine. I dropped Linda off at a relative's house. She's fine too." His family was just staring at him, completely bewildered. They said, "Do you not understand that you've been missing for 3 days?" He just seemed to be in a daze, trying to tell them over and over that everything was perfectly fine. But as they pressed him for more details, asking him specifically, what were you doing? Specifically, how did you get lost? Specifically, what time did you drop Linda off? They needed to know all the details, and as they did that, Eddie started to seem confused. It was like he was slowly realizing that, oh my goodness, I actually don't know what happened. I don't remember. So his family called the relative that Eddie had claimed he dropped Linda off with. When the relative picked up the phone, they confirmed the family's worst fears. They said, "No, we don't have Linda here. I have not spoken to Eddie, and I have not spoken to Linda in days." And so the family turned back to a now very distressed Eddie, and they asked him again, "Where is Linda?" And this time, Eddie just looked at them with fear in his eyes and said, "I have no idea." The family immediately contacted the police, and a massive search was launched for Linda. They looked all over the park for days and days, but there was no sign of her anywhere. People were starting to get really worried, fearing the worst. And then on Thursday, 3 days after Eddie had mysteriously reemerged from the park, and 5 days after they had originally gone missing, there was a breakthrough. Some searchers who were on ATVs were about 2 miles away from the entrance of the park, navigating through a very thick, dense area of the forest. And that's when they found Linda. And she was alive. Initially, just like her brother Eddie, she seemed to have no real idea what was going on. She said she didn't understand how she got to where she was, and she was just really, really confused. So they brought her back to a hospital and put her under a doctor's care. And thankfully, she ended up being physically fine. But as she was laying in the hospital bed, resting, she started to kind of come to, and her memories started flooding back. And she began to tell the story of what happened to her out there. And it was absolutely unbelievable. She said that she and Eddie had gone into the park to find that fishing spot. At some point, they had stepped off the trail thinking they were going to find it easily, but they didn't. They got turned around and became lost. She said they were confident they were going to find the trail and get out on the same day, but they didn't. And so the sun went down, and they were forced to spend the night out in the wild. The next morning, they got up and they continued to look around. They were yelling for help, but there was no one around. They were in this very dense, remote part of the forest, and all day long, again, they were looking for the trail, and they just couldn't find it. And so that night, for a second time, they had to sleep out in the wild. Linda said that her memory, starting with the next day, which was Monday, started to get really foggy. She said she remembered waking up, and for some reason, she just got up and started running frantically into the woods. She thinks it might have been because she thought Eddie was hurt, and she was running to try and get help. And so it must have been around this time that Eddie, in his own dazed and confused state, got up and somehow managed to meander his way successfully out of the park. Meanwhile, Linda said she was just running like a maniac, deeper and deeper into the middle of the woods, screaming for help from anyone, even though she was in the middle of nowhere. And then, miraculously, she says she saw a group of people way off in the distance. It looked like a group of hikers. She was so relieved. She started yelling for them and waving her arms, trying to get their attention. She said they all stopped what they were doing, and they turned to look at her. But they didn't show any sign that they had actually heard her. They weren't waving back. They weren't calling out to her. They were just looking at her. Linda said she thought that was pretty odd, but she was desperate. So she just kept on running towards them, screaming and yelling and trying to get their attention. She said when she got about 100 meters away from them, instead of them reciprocating her waves or making any sound, they all just ducked behind trees. It looked like they were trying to hide from her. Linda said this was the first time that she felt really, really unsettled by what was happening. But she was desperate for help, and so she just kept walking slowly towards them. She got to about 50 meters away when they all poked their heads out from behind the trees and looked out at her, and then quickly poked their heads back in again like they were playing a terrifying game of peekaboo. They were clearly not trying to interact with her. Linda said she felt really scared now, and she stopped and began slowly backpedaling away from this weird group of people who were hiding behind trees. And so, while keeping her eyes on the general area where she knew they were hiding, she backed away all the way back to about 100, maybe 150 meters away again. And at that point, the group came out from behind the trees and just continued to stare at Linda in complete silence. Linda said at this point, she was absolutely terrified. She didn't know who or what those things were, but she knew they were not there to help her. And then she said her memory got really foggy again, because all of a sudden, her next memory is of her laying on the ground in a pitch black forest. Her brother was not near her, and she was hearing footsteps. She believed it was this group of people or things that were walking towards her, but it was so dark she couldn't see anything at all. And she said that all night long she just lay there frozen as she heard the sounds of these people or things walking around the perimeter of where she was laying, totally exposed in the middle of the forest. Linda said her memories from this point until the moment she was rescued are all mixed together, a confusing jumble of fear and disorientation. But she said she had one specific memory that really stood out to her because it was so terrifying. She said on one of the last mornings she was out there, she woke up, she was laying on the ground. She opened her eyes, and it was still dark, but the sun was just starting to come up, so there was enough light that she could begin to make out the shapes and layout of the forest around her. So she sat up, and she immediately got the distinct sense that she was being watched. But she didn't know by who or from where the feeling was coming. She just had this powerful, intuitive sense that eyes were on her. And as she was feeling this way, she heard a slight movement coming from off to her right. She turned her head, and standing next to a tree, about maybe 20 meters away, was the dark silhouette of a man. He was just staring at her. He had no discernible features. He was just a shadowy, human-shaped figure. And so she's horrified. And then, as her eyes adjusted, she realized there was another one. And she looked at that one, and then realized there was another one. And another one. And another one. They were all around her, standing silently by the trees. They were forming a circle around her, these dark, shadowy figures, all just looking in at her. She was so scared she couldn't even scream. And as she's looking around at all of them, it seemed like they registered that she could now see them. And at that exact moment, they all turned and started running away into the forest in all different directions. She said after that, she has no idea what the sequence of events was or what happened to her at all. All she knows is that the whole time she was out there, she was terrified. She constantly felt like there were people watching her from just out of sight in the woods. And then, at some point, rescuers showed up, and she was saved. Linda's totally bizarre account of what happened, combined with her brother Eddie's equally strange behavior and memory loss, completely baffled investigators. They really didn't know what to make of this story. How did Eddie, in a dazed state, manage to find his way out of the park, and why did he have a false memory of Linda being safe at a relative's house? And who, or what, were the silent, hiding people that Linda was seeing in the woods? And why can't either of them remember 90% of their own experience? One common theory is that they must have eaten some wild berries or some other plant that had hallucinogenic properties, and that they were literally just hallucinating the whole time. However, if you follow along with the wider phenomenon of these strange disappearances, you know there are lots of other examples of people who go missing in the woods of North America that never ingest any food or any liquid at all, so there's no possibility of a hallucinogen in their system. And they still have experiences that are eerily similar to what Linda and Eddie went through. So, how do you explain that? What these stories leave us with is the unsettling feeling that sometimes the simplest explanation just isn't enough. Let me know what you think about today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a complete playlist of true crime episodes waiting for you right now. Somewhere in the forests of North America, there are still gaps in these stories. The missing hours, the lost memories, the missing people, and whatever is waiting for them out there might still be there right now. Thank you for listening. See you next time. We often convince ourselves that we have evolved far beyond our primitive fears, feeling perfectly safe behind locked doors and the bright lights of modern cities. But take a moment to ask yourself, have you ever felt that sudden chill down your spine? that deep gut-level instinct whispering that someone or something is watching you from the shadows, even when your logic tells you you're in the most desolate, empty place on Earth? The three stories of Chris, Paul, and Sam are not just terrifying anecdotes about deep woods or jagged mountains. They are a stark testament to the truth that humans walk a razor-thin line between reality and the unknown. From the invisible gaze piercing the back of a park ranger in the dead of night, to the mountain lion tracking the exact footsteps of a weary hiker, to the sinister message, "Sleep well." Scratched into the dust of a car window by a human predator, these encounters serve as a grim reminder that we are not the masters of the food chain we think we are. When the silence of nature becomes heavy and your survival instincts begin to scream a warning, listen. In this world, the moment you become complacent about your own safety is the moment you transform from an observer into a target. Behind every corner, every rustle of dry leaves, lies a darkness waiting to be unveiled. Are you truly prepared to face the raw, unvarnished reality? Because behind every case, there is a world that only reveals its truth to those brave enough to confront the darkest, strangest corners of life. We like to think that we've evolved past the need for primitive survival instincts. We live in houses with locked doors, we have cell phones, and we've conquered the top of the food chain. But for 200,000 years, our ancestors survived by listening to a whisper in their subconscious, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you're being watched, even when your eyes tell you that there is absolutely nobody there. Most of the time, we brush it off as paranoia. But what if that feeling wasn't a glitch in your brain, but a warning? In the summer of 2007, Chris was a park ranger in the dense, sprawling forests of southeastern Pennsylvania. He loved the job, mostly. The hiking, the isolation, the quiet majesty of the woods, that was his element. But every job comes with its share of tedium, and for Chris, that meant the late-night office work, hours spent hunched over paperwork while the forest outside breathed in the dark. One August night, the atmosphere in the office was unusually heavy. Chris was there with his supervisor, Mike. Around midnight, Mike realized they needed some equipment from a tool shed located about a half-mile down the access road. He grabbed his keys, told Chris he'd be back in 15 minutes, and disappeared into the trees. As soon as the truck's headlights faded into the darkness, the silence of the office felt suddenly oppressive. Chris decided he needed a break. He pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the humid night air. The office sat at the edge of a large, gravelly staff parking lot. Beyond that, the woods began a wall of black pine and thick brush that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Chris sat on the front steps, staring aimlessly toward the tree line. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. It was perfectly, unnervingly still. And then, it hit him. It started as a subtle shift in the air, a sense of being intruded upon. His skin crawled. He felt the weight of a gaze pressing against his back, coming from somewhere out in the dark. Instinctively, he whipped his head around, expecting to see Mike standing there, or perhaps a coworker playing a prank. But the office was empty. It was just him. He turned back to the forest, his heart rate picking up. He scanned the tree line, his eyes straining against the shadows. Nothing. No movement. No snapping twigs. Yet, the feeling remained an icy prickle on his spine that screamed, "Leave now." Chris wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He spent his life in these woods. He knew the difference between a deer and a predator. He told himself he was just tired, that the silence was playing tricks on his mind. But the instinct was too loud to ignore. He decided to do a quick sweep. He walked down the steps and moved through the parking lot, checking behind the parked trucks. The lot was deserted. He kept walking until he stood at the very edge of the woods. He looked into the black void of the trees, feeling like he was standing on the precipice of something wrong. He waited. He listened. Again, nothing. It's just in your head, he told himself. Go back inside. He turned his back on the forest to walk back to the office. He took 3 steps, and then the world exploded into action. Whoosh! A sound tore through the air, inches from his left ear. It was the distinct, sharp hiss of something heavy and wooden spinning through the air, a projectile thrown with brutal overhand force. It missed his head by a hair's breadth and clattered into the dirt behind him. Chris didn't think. He reacted. He threw himself onto the gravel, scrambling into a defensive crouch, his eyes locked on the tree line. His pulse was thundering in his ears. He waited for a charge, for a footstep, for a voice. But the forest remained dead silent. He scrambled to his feet, backpedaling toward the office, his eyes darting frantically across the dark. He snatched up a heavy stick, ready to defend himself, but he couldn't find the object that had been thrown at him. He scanned the ground, but in the moonless shadows of the trees, it was like the projectile had vanished into thin air. He didn't wait to find it. He sprinted the remaining distance to the office, slammed the door shut, and threw the deadbolt. He was shaking, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. 20 minutes later, the roar of an engine broke the silence. Mike's truck came tearing up the access road, tires kicking up gravel, headlights swerving wildly. The truck screeched to a halt, and Mike vaulted out, running toward the office with a frantic urgency. Chris unlocked the door, ready to explain what had just happened, but the words died in his throat the moment he saw Mike's face. Mike was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, his movements jittery and erratic. What happened? Chris asked. Mike didn't answer right away. He paced the small room, his hands trembling. Finally, he looked at Chris. I went to the shed, he said, his voice tight. I was inside getting the gear when the hair on my arm stood up. I got that feeling like someone was staring through the back of my skull. Chris stared at him, chills breaking out across his skin. I looked everywhere, Mike continued. I checked inside the shed, behind it, around the perimeter. I was alone, but I couldn't shake it. I felt like prey. Mike took a shaky breath. I grabbed the stuff as fast as I could and ran for the truck. Just as I started to drive away, I heard footsteps behind the shed. Running footsteps. I didn't even look back. I just floored it. Mike looked down at his shaking hands. But right before I turned the corner to leave, I looked in the side mirror. I saw him. A man standing right at the edge of the woods, stepping into the shadows. He wasn't a hiker. He wasn't supposed to be there. Chris finally spoke. Mike, something was thrown at me. From the trees. They sat in the office for the rest of the night, backs to the wall, watching the door. They didn't sleep. Every creak of the building sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind felt like an intruder. The next morning, they filed a report, but the woods were empty. The man was gone. They never found the object that had been thrown, and they never found out who was hiding in the trees. To this day, neither of them can explain it, but they learned the hard way. When your subconscious tells you that you aren't alone, you should listen. Because in the deep, dark silence of the forest, your instincts are the only thing keeping you from becoming part of the shadows. And if that instinct can sense danger we can't see, sometimes it's because something out there is already watching and waiting. The story of the park ranger serves as a chilling reminder that our survival instincts are more than just superstition. They are the ancient, silent alarms hardwired into our DNA to keep us alive when we step into the unknown. But what happens when you're not just being watched by a stranger, but hunted by something that sees you not as a human, but as food? That is exactly what Paul found out in the remote heart of Utah, far from civilization, where the wilderness plays by a much harsher set of rules. In the summer of 2015, Paul, an experienced outdoorsman, set out on a 7-day solo backpacking trip through a place known as Dark Canyon Wilderness. It's an unforgiving, spectacular landscape where the steep rock walls are so high they block out the sun for most of the day, earning the area its name. It's a place where you can go for a week without seeing another living soul, a place where the silence is absolute, and where, if you make a mistake, there is no one around to hear you scream. On his final day, Paul was exhausted but feeling accomplished. About a mile into a morning hike, he stumbled upon a massive set of elk antlers lying in the brush. They were beautiful, a perfect prize for his trip, so he lashed the 15-pound rack to his pack and pushed on. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but as the hours wore on, the weight became a burden. He found himself moving slower, his muscles screaming, and before he knew it, he had depleted his water supply. Dehydrated and desperate, Paul reached a plateau where he planned to camp. He dropped his heavy pack, shed the antlers, and wandered off to find a source of water. Miraculously, he found a stagnant, murky pool. It was far from ideal, but he figured he could boil it. As he set up his tent and started a small fire, a thought occurred to him. If there was standing water here, there had to be a natural spring nearby. Why settle for boiling gray sludge when he could find fresh running water? He left his gear, including his bottles, at the campsite and began trekking up the mountain. He hiked for about half a mile before finding a beautiful, clear spring. He dropped to his knees and drank greedily, but as he finished, a cold wave of dread washed over him. He reached for his belt to fill his bottles, only to realize he had left everything at his camp. He cursed his luck. He had to go all the way back. As he turned to head back down the mountain, the atmosphere changed. The forest, which had felt peaceful moments ago, now felt heavy. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like a footstep. Every snap of a twig sounded like a deliberate movement. He felt an intense, prickling sensation on his neck, the distinct feeling that something was behind him, tracking his every move. He kept turning his head, expecting to see a stranger, a hiker, anyone. But there was nothing. He reached his camp, gathered his bottles, and felt a strong urge to just pack up and leave. But he needed the water. He wouldn't last the hike out without it. To calm his nerves, he grabbed a thick, heavy branch, a makeshift club, and started back up toward the spring. The anxiety returned instantly, thicker and more suffocating than before. He felt like he was being measured. He felt like he was being hunted. He filled the bottles as quickly as he could and turned to head back to camp. As he descended a small rock face and landed on the dirt path he had traveled just minutes earlier, he stopped dead in his tracks. His blood turned to ice. There, pressed into the dirt, were the fresh, clear prints of a mountain lion. But they weren't just on the trail. They were positioned directly between his own footprints, perfectly synchronized with his gait. The predator had been tracking his steps from inches away, keeping itself perfectly obscured in the shadows of the brush. It hadn't just been watching him, it had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The elk antlers on his backpack hadn't just been a souvenir, they were a beacon. The mountain lion had likely seen the rack of antlers and the weight on his back, and decided that Paul was an elk, weak, struggling, and easy prey. Paul didn't look back. He sprinted the half-mile back to his campsite, dove into his tent, and zipped it shut, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He huddled in the dark, clutching his knife, listening to every vibration in the night. The mountain lion remained somewhere out there, lurking in the dark, silent and deadly. He didn't sleep a wink. He waited until the sun finally crested the horizon, brought his gear out, and moved with a speed he hadn't thought possible, finally reaching the safety of his car. He had entered the canyon seeking solitude, but he left with a terrifying lesson. In the wild, you are never truly alone, and sometimes you are not the top of the food chain. But as terrifying as that night was, Paul could at least take comfort in one thing. The creature hunting him was only following its nature. It didn't lie, it didn't plan, and it didn't take pleasure in fear. Humans, however, are a different story. While the terror of being hunted by an animal is a primal fear, there is something far more chilling about the realization that you are being stalked by another human being. In the vast, desolate stretches of the American West, where legends of lost gold and mysterious disappearances are woven into the very fabric of the landscape, 17-year-old Sam learned that lesson the hardest way possible. In April 2020, Sam, an avid outdoorsman, decided to tackle an 8-mile loop in Arizona's Superstition Mountains. The range is infamous, named for the endless tales of mysterious deaths and vanishings that have plagued it for decades. Locals tend to avoid the deeper canyons, but Sam, who prided himself on his knowledge of the area, wasn't the superstitious type. He planned a solo overnight trip, figuring he'd hike 4 miles in, camp under the stars, and return the next morning. Things went wrong before the hike even began. Traffic and harsh road conditions delayed him significantly, and he didn't reach the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. With the sun already beginning to dip, Sam knew he was cutting it close. He considered turning back, but his confidence pushed him onward. He thought he could move fast enough to cover at least a few miles before true darkness set in. But the terrain was unforgiving, and the trail grew treacherous under the fading light. Within hours, the desert was swallowed by absolute blackness. Using his flashlight, Sam found a clearing about 30 feet off the path, a suitable spot for the night. He noticed an old, weathered fire pit, confirming that others had camped here before. He didn't bring a tent. Instead, he rigged a simple tarp between the pine trees, unrolled his sleeping bag, and got a fire crackling. As he sat there, eating a can of beans in the small circle of warmth, the silence of the mountains began to feel heavy. It wasn't the peaceful silence of nature, it was a pressurized, watching silence. Then, it happened. A rock about the size of a marble whistled through the air and landed with a sharp clack at his feet. Sam froze. He looked toward the tree line, but the fire had blinded his night vision. Beyond the flames, there was only impenetrable darkness. He scanned the trees for 15 minutes, his heart thumping, but heard nothing. He rationalized it. Perhaps a rock had fallen from a cliff, or a branch had shaken it loose. He managed to calm himself down, convinced it was just his imagination playing tricks on his frayed nerves. He crawled into his sleeping bag and eventually drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. He woke hours later to an overwhelming sense of dread. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the air felt cold and wrong. He laid perfectly still, listening. From the darkness, perhaps 30 or 40 meters away, came the distinct sound of rustling leaves. Something was walking, not like an animal, but with the calculated, heavy gait of a person moving through the brush. The sound moved closer, then faded. Sam reached out instinctively to grab his flashlight from the ground beside him. His hand hit nothing but dirt. His stomach dropped. He had placed that light inches from his head before bed. He sat up, his breath hitching, and searched the immediate area. Nothing. He scanned the dark with his eyes, and then a beam of moonlight caught a glint of plastic. About 10 meters away, his flashlight was lying on the ground, pointing back toward his camp. The realization was sickening. Someone had stood over him while he slept, reached down, taken his light, and moved it. It wasn't an accident. It was a lure, a deliberate attempt to draw him away from the safety of his camp and into the dark. Adrenaline surged through him. He didn't move toward the light. Instead, he scrambled to his feet, grabbed his knife, and began frantically throwing every stick and log he could reach onto the dying fire. He needed light. He needed a barrier. He spent the next several hours standing in the center of his campsite, his back to the fire, knife gripped in a white-knuckled fist. Throughout the night, he heard them. Footsteps would approach the edge of the clearing, stop, and then retreat. Every time the fire dimmed, the footsteps grew closer. Every time he stoked the flames, they backed away. It was a terrifying, silent dance that lasted until 3 a.m. when he ran out of firewood. With no more fuel to keep the perimeter lit, Sam stood in the fading light, waiting for the inevitable. At one point, he heard movement just 3 meters away, hidden behind a thick cluster of pine trees. Whoever it was stood there, motionless, waiting for the fire to die. Sam stood there for 2 hours, facing the trees, ready to fight for his life, his mind racing with the image of a shadow emerging from the dark. But the attack never came. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, the footsteps retreated, disappearing into the rugged terrain. Sam didn't pack. He didn't wait. He grabbed his essentials, bolted from the camp, and didn't stop sprinting until he reached his car at the trailhead. He was shaking so violently he could barely get the key in the ignition. He drove 20 miles in total silence, the trauma of the night playing over and over in his mind. He finally pulled into a gas station, desperate for a drink and a moment to breathe. He got out of his car, his legs feeling like lead, and as he walked around the back of the vehicle to get a bottle of water, he stopped. Written in the dust on his back window in clear, mocking letters was a message. Sleep well? Sam realized then that he hadn't been lost in the mountains. He had been hunted. The realization that someone had stalked him, toyed with him, and watched him suffer in fear, and then followed him all the way to his car was a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. He had gone into the Superstition Mountains to prove he was a capable, confident outdoorsman. He left with the terrifying confirmation that in the deep, dark places of the world, there are predators who don't need claws or teeth to be the most dangerous thing in the woods. These stories of Chris, Paul, and Sam serve as more than just unsettling accounts of life in the wild. They are a profound reminder of how fragile our sense of security truly is. We walk through life comforted by the belief that we have outgrown the dangers of the natural world, that our technology and intellect have permanently separated us from the roles of the hunted. Yet, in the quiet of a Pennsylvania forest, the isolation of a Utah canyon, or the shadows of the Superstition Mountains, that illusion dissolves in an instant. What makes these experiences truly haunting isn't just the physical danger, but the realization that we are often being observed long before we even suspect a threat. Whether it is an unseen predator pacing in the brush, or a human shadow lingering at the edge of our camp, the result is the same. The predatory gaze is absolute. These encounters expose the uncomfortable truth that our survival instincts, those ancient pulses deep within our subconscious, are not relics of a bygone era. They are vital, living tools that we have largely learned to ignore in favor of convenience and modern comfort. When we dismiss that inexplicable bad feeling or the sudden cold weight of being watched, we are choosing to ignore the very thing that kept our ancestors alive for millennia. These stories force us to confront the fact that the wilderness is not a static playground. It is a space where we are constantly being measured, analyzed, and occasionally marked as prey. The true horror lies in the uncertainty, in the lingering question of what might have happened had these individuals not heeded those primal warnings or caught that final fleeting glimpse of their stalker. Ultimately, these cases leave us with a lingering, unsettling question. How often have we been watched, only to walk away unharmed, simply because the observer chose to let us go? We are never as separate from the natural order as we pretend to be. The next time you find yourself alone, surrounded by the deceptive silence of the woods or the darkness of an empty road, remember that you are not just an observer. You are part of an ancient, unforgiving cycle. Listen to your gut, respect the silence, and never mistake a lack of visibility for a lack of presence. In the grand design of the wild, the hunter rarely makes their presence known until it is far too late to run. Stay vigilant, because the darkness is always listening, and it never truly sleeps.
Think about the choices you make every single day. Most of them feel completely minor. You choose what to eat for breakfast, which route to take to work, or whether to say hello to a stranger. You do not spend hours agonizing over these decisions because they seem totally harmless. But life has a very strange way of working. Sometimes the smallest, most insignificant choice you make can set off a massive chain reaction. A single moment can ripple outward and completely reshape your entire future, or even the lives of millions of other people around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories of real people who made simple choices that led to some of the most famous, unexpected turning points in modern history. And as you will see, none of them could have possibly guessed where their actions would lead. Our first story begins on a cold morning on the 17th of January, 1977. A 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore was walking slowly across a yard towards an old abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. He was not alone. In fact, Gary was surrounded by several heavily armed prison guards. The guards were tense. They kept their hands close to their weapons because they were terrified that Gary might try to make a run for it. They thought he might break away and force them to shoot him right there in the yard. But the truth was, Gary had absolutely no intention of running. He had been waiting for this exact moment for months, and he was completely ready. So Gary kept walking, his boots crunching on the cold ground, flanked by the guards. He did not hesitate for a single second when they reached the entrance of the concrete building. He just stepped inside. The interior of the old factory was massive, cold, and completely empty. There was no machinery left, no boxes, nothing. It was just a giant, cavernous space with concrete floors and high ceilings. But way across the room, pushed up against the far back wall, sat a single wooden chair. Gary did not need to be told what to do. He immediately began walking across the empty concrete floor directly toward that chair. When he reached it, he turned around and sat down. As soon as he was seated, the guards moved in quickly. They took thick leather straps and began securing his wrists and his ankles to the wooden chair so he could not move at all. Throughout this entire process, Gary did not struggle. He did not say a word. He did not even look at the guards. Instead, his eyes were locked on the opposite side of the empty room. On the far wall, directly across from where Gary was strapped down, was a large, heavy black curtain. It looked like someone had wheeled out a stage curtain to block the view of whatever was behind it. And as Gary stared at this curtain, he noticed there were 5 small, evenly spaced slots cut into the fabric. Gary could not see through those dark slots, but he knew exactly what was behind them. He knew that at each of those 5 stations, a police officer was standing with a loaded rifle. They were the firing squad, and they were there because Gary himself had specifically requested them. To understand how Gary ended up in this chair, we have to go back to the summer of 1976. Gary was a troubled man who had spent most of his adult life in and out of reform schools and prisons for various crimes. But in July of 1976, his behavior turned incredibly violent. Over the course of just 2 days, Gary robbed and murdered 2 innocent young men in Utah. First, he shot Max Jensen, a gas station attendant who complied with all of his demands. The very next night, he shot Benny Bushnell, a student working at a motel. Both men did exactly what Gary asked, but he killed them anyway. Gary was caught almost immediately, put on trial, and convicted of murder. In October of 1976, the jury sentenced him to death. Now, at the time, this was a massive deal. The United States had not executed anyone in nearly 10 years due to a Supreme Court ruling on the death penalty. Gary's case was going to be the first execution in a decade, and it sparked a huge media storm. Almost immediately, people stepped in to try and stop it. Gary's own mother, along with organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, filed multiple appeals to try and get his sentence changed to life in prison. But while most death row inmates would have been grateful for the help, Gary was furious. He did not want to spend the rest of his life locked in a concrete box. He believed that life without parole was a fate far worse than death. And so, Gary fought against his own lawyers. He pushed the courts to go ahead with the execution as quickly as possible. Under Utah law at the time, death row inmates were allowed to choose how they wanted to die. They could choose hanging, or they could choose a firing squad. Gary chose the firing squad. And so, after months of legal battles, his request was finally granted. Now, back in the abandoned cannery, the guards finished tightening the leather straps on Gary's wrists and ankles. They stepped away, leaving him alone in the chair. Then, a prison chaplain walked over. He stood beside Gary and read him his last rites. When he finished, the chaplain looked down at Gary and asked him if he had any final words he wanted to share with the world. Gary did not hesitate. He looked up at the chaplain, completely calm, and simply said, "Let's do it." The chaplain nodded, stepped back, and signaled to the men behind the curtain. 5 rifle barrels poked through these small slots in the black fabric. A moment later, a loud blast echoed through the cavernous room, and Gary Gilmore was dead. At this point, you might be wondering how this dark story has anything to do with a small choice changing the world. Well, we have to fast forward 10 years to the year 1987. In Portland, Oregon, a young marketing executive named Dan Whedon was sitting in a conference room at his advertising agency, Whedon and Kennedy. Dan and his team had recently signed a new client. It was a sports shoe company that had a lot of potential, but they were struggling. They were trying desperately to compete with Reebok, which was absolutely dominating the fitness market at the time. This shoe company had hired Dan to create a massive breakthrough marketing campaign that would help them stand out and become a household name. But the problem was, Dan and his team were completely stuck. For hours, they sat in that meeting room, tossing around different ideas and pitches. They wanted something that would connect with serious, hardcore athletes, but also with ordinary people who were just trying to get off the couch and go for a jog. Every idea they came up with felt flat. Nothing had that punch they needed. Dan was getting more and more frustrated as the hours ticked by. And then, completely out of nowhere, Dan had a sudden epiphany. He was not even sure why the thought entered his mind, but he suddenly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore from 10 years earlier. Like millions of other Americans, Dan had watched the news coverage of the execution back in 1977. And for some strange reason, as he sat in that frustrating meeting, he remembered the very last words Gary had spoken right before the rifles fired. Dan thought about the phrase, "Let's do it." It was incredibly simple. It was direct, and it possessed a strange, rugged determination. It was about taking action without overthinking, without making excuses. But Dan thought the phrase could be just a little bit stronger. He decided to tweak it slightly to make it sound more universal. He changed the word "let's" to the word "just." And so, the phrase became, "Just do it." Dan pitched the 3-word slogan to his client, which was Nike. At first, the executives at Nike actually hated it. Phil Knight, the co-founder of the company, thought it was a terrible idea and a waste of money. But Dan convinced them to trust his instinct and run with it. In 1988, Nike launched their first commercial featuring the new slogan showing an 80-year-old man running across the Golden Gate Bridge. The campaign was an overnight sensation. The slogan resonated deeply with people all over the world. Within just a few years, Nike's sales skyrocketed, doubling their business and turning them into the multi-billion-dollar global empire they are today. All because a creative director in Oregon randomly remembered the final words of a convicted killer facing a firing squad. Our second story takes us to the city of London in the year 2009. A 23-year-old aspiring actor named Chris was walking down a busy street on his way to a date. Chris was incredibly stressed out. He had very little money in his bank account, and he was struggling to pay his rent. He desperately needed a big break, and he was hoping that his luck was about to change because the very next morning he had an incredibly important job interview. But for tonight, Chris had to focus on his date. He wanted to make a good impression, but his empty wallet made things very difficult. He could not afford a fancy restaurant or a nice bar. And so, as they walked through the chilly London air, Chris made a choice. He decided to take his date into a local McDonald's. Now, this McDonald's was not a romantic spot. It was extremely loud, the floors were sticky, and it was absolutely packed with people who had been out drinking. but it was the only thing Chris could afford. He looked at his date, feeling a bit embarrassed, and asked if this was okay. She was incredibly understanding. She just smiled, told him it was perfectly fine, and they got in line to order. After they got their food, they turned around to find a place to sit. But the restaurant was so crowded that every single table was completely full. Chris and his date began walking through the dining area, looking for any open spot. Finally, Chris spotted a table where a single man was sitting by himself. The man was quiet, minding his own business, and eating his meal. Crucially, there were 2 empty chairs at his table. Chris walked over, trying to be as polite as possible, and asked the man if they could sit in the empty chairs. He promised they would not bother him and would leave as soon as they finished eating. The man looked up, shrugged, and told them to go ahead. Chris and his date sat down, and they began to eat and talk. But the problem was, Chris was incredibly distracted. His mind kept drifting to the massive job interview he had scheduled for the next morning. He was so anxious about it that he was barely paying attention to the conversation. He just wanted to finish his food, walk his date home, and go to bed so he could be fully rested and focused for the interview. As Chris sat there lost in his thoughts, he suddenly realized that the atmosphere at the table had completely changed. The man sitting across from them had stopped eating. He had turned his head and was now staring directly at Chris's date. The look on his face was not friendly at all. It was aggressive and intensely uncomfortable. Before Chris could even ask what was going on, the stranger opened his mouth and began hurling incredibly cruel insults at Chris's date. He started making fun of the way she looked and the way she talked. Chris was stunned. He looked at his date, then back at the man, trying to understand why this stranger was suddenly attacking them out of nowhere. But the man did not stop. He looked directly at the young woman and called her an ugly pig. Now, Chris had never been in a physical fight in his entire life. He was a gentle guy, and he hated violence. On top of that, Chris was not a particularly large man. He stood at about 5 feet, 8 inches tall. But hearing this stranger brutally insult his date was more than he could take. He decided he had to stand up for her. Chris stood up from his chair, looked at the man, and told him to get up. But as soon as the stranger stood up, Chris realized he had made a massive mistake. The man was an absolute giant. He towered over Chris, blocking out the bright fluorescent lights of the restaurant. But Chris knew he could not back down now. He took a deep breath, wound up his fist, and punched the giant man right in the face. It did not go well. The punch barely registered, and the massive stranger immediately proceeded to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the middle of the crowded McDonald's. He threw Chris to the ground, hitting him repeatedly while the other customers watched in shock. By the time the giant finally stopped and wandered out of the restaurant into the night, Chris was bruised, bleeding, and utterly humiliated. Chris and his date left the restaurant immediately. Chris kept apologizing over and over again, feeling like a complete failure. His date tried to reassure him, but they were both incredibly shaken up. They went their separate ways, and Chris went home, crawling into bed with his body aching. The next morning, Chris woke up early. He walked into his bathroom, looked in the mirror, and gasped. His face was a total mess. He had a massive, swollen black eye, and his jaw was deeply bruised. He looked like he had just escaped a war zone. Chris felt a wave of pure panic. He was supposed to walk into a high-end professional job interview in just a couple of hours. He wondered if he should just call and cancel. How could anyone take him seriously when he looked like a street brawler? But Chris knew this was the biggest opportunity of his career. He decided he could not let his fear ruin his chances. He put on his best suit, walked out the door, and headed to the interview. When he arrived at the office, he was escorted into a room with the interviewers. As soon as he walked in, he could feel their eyes lock onto his massive black eye. It was incredibly awkward. Nobody asked him about it, and Chris did not want to explain that he had gotten beaten up at a McDonald's the night before. He just tried to remain confident, deliver his lines, and ignore the physical pain in his face. By the end of the meeting, Chris was convinced he had completely blown it. He thanked them for their time and left the building, assuming he would never hear from them again. But a few days later, Chris received a phone call that would change his life forever. It turned out that the interviewers did not hate his black eye at all. In fact, they absolutely loved it. You see, the job Chris was interviewing for was not an office job. It was an audition for a starring role in a massive new fantasy television series. The character they were casting was a gritty, battle-hardened young warrior who constantly found himself in dangerous, violent situations. When Chris had walked into the room looking like he had just been in a real fistfight, the casting directors realized they did not need to use makeup to make him look tough. He looked completely authentic, rugged, and real. They offered Chris the role on the spot. That television show was Game of Thrones, and Chris was cast as the legendary character Jon Snow. Today, the world knows him by his stage name, Kit Harington. He went from being a broke, young actor who could barely afford a cheap meal to a global superstar nominated for multiple Emmy and Globe Awards. All because he made the brave, impulsive choice to stand up to a giant in a London McDonald's. Our third story takes us back to the year 1925, to the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. A 21-year-old college senior named Ted was sitting inside his dorm room surrounded by his closest friends. The group had managed to get their hands on a bottle of gin, and they were busy pouring drinks and celebrating. Now, to understand the gravity of this situation, we have to remember the time period. In 1925, the United States was in the middle of Prohibition. The law made the manufacture and consumption of alcohol completely illegal. It did not matter that they were 21 years old. Having that bottle of gin in their dorm room was a serious crime that could result in arrest. But Ted was willing to take the risk because he had so much to celebrate. He was a brilliant senior who was about to graduate with high honors. More importantly, he had just been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine, The Jack-O-Lantern. For Ted, this was a massive deal. He had dreams of becoming a professional writer and cartoonist. Being the editor was the perfect stepping stone to a successful career. So, feeling incredibly happy and successful, Ted took a drink and passed the bottle around. But as the night went on and they got louder, they suddenly heard a loud knock on the door. The room went silent. Ted got up, opened the door, and his heart sank. Standing in the hallway were two police officers and the college dean. Ted and his friends were caught red-handed. Fortunately, the police decided not to press criminal charges, so nobody went to jail. The school also decided not to expel Ted or his friends, allowing them to graduate. But the school still handed down a severe punishment. Dartmouth stripped Ted of his academic honors and forced him to step down from his position as editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern. To make matters worse, the dean decreed that he was completely banned from submitting any writing or drawings to the magazine. Ted was devastated. Losing the position felt like his entire future was being ripped away. He spent days in his room wondering how he would ever get his career off the ground if he could not even publish his work in a college paper. At first, Ted thought about pleading with the dean to lift the ban. But he knew the administration was incredibly strict, and they were definitely not going to change their minds. He was completely stuck. But then, Ted had a brilliant idea. He realized that while he was banned from submitting work under his own name, the magazine's staff still accepted submissions from the general public. They did not always verify the identity of the people sending in cartoons. So, Ted made a clever choice. He decided to create a secret identity, a pen name. He drew a series of new cartoons and signed them with a completely different name. He decided to use his middle name, which was his mother's maiden name. The name he chose was Seuss. Ted quietly submitted his drawings to the magazine under his new pseudonym. The new editorial staff at the Jack-O-Lantern had absolutely no idea that the submissions were coming from the banned former editor. They looked at the drawings, fell in love with the unique, whimsical art style, and immediately published them. Ted was thrilled. Not only was he able to keep doing what he loved, but he actually found a strange sense of freedom in writing and drawing under a fake name. It allowed him to be more creative and playful than ever before. He kept up the ruse for the rest of his senior year, graduating without the school ever finding out. And after graduation, when Ted decided to pursue writing and illustrating full-time, he chose to keep using that very same pen name. He added the prefix Doctor to the beginning of it, partly as a joke because his father had always wanted him to go to medical school and become a doctor. Over the course of his long and legendary career, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books under his famous pen name. His stories would capture the imaginations of hundreds of millions of children and adults all over the world, teaching generations of kids how to read and winning him a Pulitzer Prize. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but the entire world knows him simply as Dr. Seuss. All because a college senior decided to share a bottle of gin with his friends on a quiet night in 1925, got caught, and had to find a creative way to beat the system. It is truly mind-blowing to think about how these lives were fully reshaped by moments that seemed so small. A desperate man facing a firing squad speaks 3 words that become the face of a giant sports empire. A young actor gets into a violent restaurant fight and walks away with the role of a legendary hero. A college kid gets caught with a bottle of illegal gin and ends up creating a famous pen name. We are all always just one small, unexpected choice away from a completely different destiny. Did these stories make you realize how one small decision can change everything? Or are you ready for what comes next? We like to think that we are in complete control of our lives. We make plans, we set goals, and we follow a routine day after day, expecting everything to go exactly the way we want it to. But the truth is, we are all just one random event away from having our entire world turned completely upside down. Sometimes these events are incredibly terrifying. Other times they seem like complete accidents of fate. But every once in a while, something happens that is so wild, so incredibly unlikely, that if you saw it in a movie, you would probably shake your head and say there is no way that could ever happen in real life. Today, I am going to tell you 3 stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them. These are stories of survival, of passion, and of resilience in the face of absolute disaster. These are the kinds of stories that are truly stranger than fiction. These events did not just change their lives in an instant, but in some of these cases, they went on to change the lives of millions of other people all around the world. We will explore how their choices shaped their paths. These stories are a slight departure from what we normally do on this channel, but they still have that same mysterious, gripping feeling that keeps you wondering what is going to happen next. So, if you enjoy these types of narratives, let me know in the comments and we will definitely do more of them. But before we dive into these incredible events, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in a straightforward storytelling format, then you have definitely come to the right place, because that is exactly what we do here, and we upload new episodes once a week. If that sounds like something you would enjoy, please go ahead and put glitter inside the like buttons, car vents, so that the very next time they turn on their air conditioning, they get a giant, sparkling surprise blown all over the inside of their car. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly stories. Now, let us get right into today's first story. It was the afternoon of the 9th of July, 2001. A 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen was walking through a dense stretch of woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody was carrying a heavy bag of camping supplies, and his shoulders were starting to ache from the weight. He had come out to these rugged woods for a weekend camping trip with his father and the rest of his local Boy Scout troop. About 30 minutes earlier, Cody had decided to break off from the main group. They were all set up at their primary campsite, but Cody realized they had left some very important gear back in his father's truck. Since the truck was parked a couple of miles away, Cody volunteered to hike back alone to grab the extra supplies. He made it to the truck without any issues, loaded up his bag, and turned right back around to head back to camp. As Cody hiked along the dirt path, he let his mind wander. He was not really paying attention to his surroundings. Instead, he was daydreaming about the campfire that night. He was trying to come up with the perfect spooky story to tell the other scouts, to impress them and show them how tough he was. But as he kept walking and thinking, a strange feeling started to creep over him. He stopped walking and looked around. He realized that the trees and the rocks did not look familiar at all. He had been walking for quite a long time, and by his calculations, he should have reached the campsite by now. At first, Cody did not panic. He was a Boy Scout, after all. He told himself that he must have just taken a wrong turn somewhere when he was lost in thought. He figured the smartest thing to do would be to simply retrace his steps, head back to his father's truck, and start the hike over again. That way, he would at least know exactly where he was, even if he ended up being really late getting back to the camp. But as he turned around and started walking, he quickly realized he had no idea which way he had come from. The forest was thick, and because he had not been paying attention, he had drifted far off the main trail. Within minutes, Cody knew he was completely lost, and a cold wave of panic began to settle in his chest. Hours went by. Cody walked frantically through the dense wilderness, desperately calling out for his father or anyone else who might hear him. But the only sound returning to him was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. To make matters worse, as the afternoon started to fade into evening, the sky began to turn a dark, angry purple. Huge storm clouds were rolling over the mountains. Cody knew that a cold night in the Yellowstone wilderness during a storm could easily become life-threatening. But he tried to stay positive. He told himself that his dad and the scout leaders definitely knew he was missing by now. They were probably already setting up a massive search party to find him. But Cody also knew that the wilderness was vast, and it could take them hours or even days to locate him. The thought of spending days out here alone was absolutely terrifying. He took a deep breath, calmed his heart rate down, and decided to rely on his scout training. He needed to build a shelter, find some food and water, and make a fire to keep warm until help arrived. He found a relatively flat spot beneath a tree, sat down, and dumped the contents of his heavy supply bag onto the dirt. But when he looked at what he had brought from the truck, his stomach dropped. None of the items were going to help him survive. There was no gear for building a shelter, no matches to light a fire, no food, and only a tiny bottle of water that was already almost empty. He essentially had nothing. Right at that moment, the sky opened up and a violent thunderstorm began. Cold rain and heavy hail started pounding down through the tree canopy. Lightning flashed, and thunder shook the ground beneath his feet. Terrified and freezing, Cody shoved what he could back into his bag, stood up, and just started running blindly through the dark forest, desperate to find any kind of cover. Then, a massive bolt of lightning illuminated the entire area for a split second. In that brief flash, Cody saw the dark opening of a cave right ahead of him. He scrambled over the wet rocks, threw himself inside the cave, and curled up on the hard, dry ground. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, Cody was shivering and crying. He was so overwhelmed by fear and physical exhaustion that his brain simply shut down. He closed his eyes and drifted off into a deep sleep, wondering if he would ever see his family again. The next morning, Cody woke up and crawled to the mouth of the cave. The storm had finally passed, and the sun was beginning to peek through the trees. But before he could even think about what to do next, he heard a faint, distant chopping sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Cody ran out of the cave into a small clearing and looked up. Sure enough, there was a small helicopter flying low over the tree lines, scanning the area. Cody knew he had to act fast before the helicopter flew away. He remembered a trick from his Boy Scout survival manual. He quickly unbuckled his belt, held up the shiny metal buckle, and angled it toward the sun, trying to reflect the bright sunlight directly at the helicopter cockpit. It worked perfectly. The helicopter suddenly tilted, turned in his direction, and began to hover directly above him. The pilot waved through the glass and started looking for a clearing nearby to land the aircraft. Cody was so overwhelmed with joy that he grabbed his bag and ran as fast as he could toward the clearing where the helicopter was descending. He watched as the skids touched down on the grass. Cody did not wait. He ran up to the passenger side, threw the door open, and climbed inside. The pilot turned to him, looked him in the eye, and calmly said, "Good morning." Cody was in such a state of shock and relief that he could barely speak. But when he actually looked at the face of the man who had just saved his life, his jaw dropped. He could not believe who was sitting in the pilot's seat. It turned out that the night before, when Cody did not return, his father had immediately contacted the local authorities. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, and several volunteers from the surrounding area offered to help. One of those volunteers was an amateur helicopter pilot who happened to live nearby and wanted to assist in the search. That pilot had flown 10 miles away from the original campsite to find Cody. And that pilot was none other than Harrison Ford, the legendary actor who played Han Solo in Star Wars and Indiana Jones. When Harrison Ford flew Cody back to the search headquarters and reunited him with his father, his dad assumed Cody would want to go straight home to recover from the trauma. But Cody looked at his dad and said that he wanted to go right back to the Boy Scout camp. He wanted to sit around the campfire and tell the other scouts exactly what had happened to him, because he now had a campfire story that absolutely none of them would ever believe. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes us across the Atlantic Ocean and back in time to September of 1954. A 14-year-old boy named Rich was slowly shuffling his way down the long, sterile hallway of a children's hospital in England. Rich was incredibly weak, and he coughed and wheezed with almost every single step he took. He was walking alongside several other sick children, and they were all heading toward a small classroom located inside the hospital. Rich did not know what kind of lesson they were going to have that day, and honestly, he did not really care. Anything was better than sitting alone in his cramped hospital room, staring at the walls and being bored out of his mind. Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, an infectious lung disease. Over the previous 10 weeks, he had been transferred to several different hospitals as doctors tried to treat his condition. In fact, his illness was so severe that the medical staff had recently sat his parents down and told them that Rich might have to remain hospitalized for up to 2 more years. This was a nightmare for a young boy, but unfortunately, being stuck in a hospital was nothing new to Rich. When he was just 6 years old, his appendix had burst, leading to a massive internal infection that put him into a coma for several weeks. After waking up from the coma, he had to spend nearly an entire year in a hospital bed just to recover from the ordeal. All of these prolonged hospital stays had a devastating impact on Rich's life, especially when it came to his education. He had fallen incredibly far behind in his schoolwork. Because his family was very poor and lived in a tough working-class neighborhood, they could never afford to hire a private tutor to help him catch up. As a result, Rich's entire education consisted of whatever random basic classes the various hospitals happened to offer. Sometimes a teacher would come in to teach them how to weave baskets or maybe how to do basic woodworking. It was not much of an education, but it was all he had. So, on that afternoon in 1954, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he had incredibly low expectations. He assumed it would be another boring activity just to pass the time. But the moment he stepped through the door, his eyes lit up. Sitting at the front of the room was a visiting music teacher, and scattered all around the teacher were various musical instruments. Ever since he was a little boy, Rich had dreamed of playing the drums. He remembered walking past a music store window years ago, staring at a beautiful drum set and wishing more than anything that he could play it. But his family could never afford such a luxury. Now, looking at the instruments in the classroom, Rich realized this might be his only chance. When the teacher started handing out instruments to the children, Rich did not wait. He marched right up and demanded the drum. He told the teacher he would not play anything else. The teacher smiled and handed him a simple snare drum and a pair of wooden sticks. That day, the teacher tried to lead the room of sick children through a few simple songs. The resulting noise was absolutely terrible. None of the kids knew what they were doing, and the music was objectively awful. But to Rich, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. By the time the class ended, he felt completely energized. He had not suddenly become a master drummer in 1 hour, but he had discovered a massive, burning passion for the instrument. He decided right then and there that since he was going to be trapped in this hospital for the foreseeable future, he was going to spend every single second practicing. The very next day, Rich snuck into a hospital utility closet and found some long wooden sticks that the nurses normally used for knitting. Those became his makeshift drumsticks. For the next year and a half, Rich used those knitting needles to beat a rhythm onto every single surface he could find. He drummed on his bedside table, he drummed on the metal radiator, he drummed on his own knees, and he drummed on the floor. Every few weeks, when the music teacher returned to the hospital, Rich would be the first one in the classroom, eager to learn anything he could. In 1955, at the age of 16, Rich was finally released from the hospital. He was completely cured of tuberculosis. But even though he had his health back, his life did not suddenly become easy. His family was still deeply in debt, and Rich could not afford to go back to school. Instead, he had to immediately get a full-time job working in a local factory to help his family pay the bills. Rich did not complain. He knew it was his duty to help his family, and he accepted his reality. But he never let go of his dream. Even while working long, grueling hours at the factory, he would grab pieces of wood and drum on the machinery during his breaks. He found joy in rhythm whenever and wherever he could. Then, on Christmas of 1956, everything changed. Rich's stepfather had secretly been working extra shifts and saving every spare penny he had for months. On Christmas morning, he surprised Rich with a real, actual drum kit of his own. Rich was so emotional he could barely contain himself. It was the greatest gift he had ever received. He began practicing constantly, and before long, he started playing with small local bands in his spare time. He quickly earned a reputation around town as one of the most talented and reliable drummers in the area. A few years later, a highly popular local band had a sudden falling out with their drummer and fired him. They needed a replacement fast, and since Rich was the best drummer around, they approached him and asked if he would join them. Rich immediately accepted. By that point, Rich had started using a stage name, Ringo Starr. And the band that had just hired him to be their new drummer was none other than the Beatles. Our third story takes us to the morning of Sunday, the 20th of October, 1991. A 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their beautiful home in Oakland, California. As soon as Will opened his eyes, he noticed a sharp, pungent smell in the air. It was the smell of wood smoke. Will got out of bed, walked over to the bedroom window, and pulled back the curtains. When he looked out toward the horizon, he saw a massive, thick plume of black smoke rising into the sky just beyond the edge of his neighborhood. Because wildfires are a frequent and dangerous reality in California, Will immediately became concerned. He picked up the phone and dialed 911 to report what he was seeing. But the dispatcher told him that the fire department was already all over it. The dispatcher explained that there had been a wildfire on the nearby mountainside about 600 feet away, but it had already been put out. The smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover remains. Relieved, Will went about his normal morning routine. As he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander toward his work. Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on a video game about ants and how they build their homes. He was really excited about this project, designing the virtual colonies in his head as he got dressed. But when Will looked out the window again, his heart stopped. The small plume of smoke had turned into a massive cloud of black soot, and he could see huge orange flames licking up over the trees. The wind had picked up, and the fire was moving directly toward his neighborhood at an incredibly fast speed. Will immediately called 911 again. He could tell from the dispatcher's voice that they were caught off guard and did not realize the fire had flared back up. Will knew he could not wait for help. He grabbed his wife, packed a few bare necessities, and ran out the front door. The street was filled with chaos and thick smoke. Neighbors were frantically loading their cars and preparing to flee. As they were about to speed away, Will suddenly remembered their next-door neighbors. The couple who lived there had gone away for the weekend, leaving their elderly parents to watch after their 2-year-old child. Because the grandparents did not have a car, they were completely trapped. Will ran over, pounded on their door, and helped the terrified grandparents carry the toddler to his car. He stepped on the gas and drove through the blinding smoke to safety. A week later, Will returned to his neighborhood with a police escort. When he got out of the car, he looked at where his house used to be, and it was completely gone. Every house in the neighborhood was leveled. The Oakland Hills firestorm had burned for 4 days, destroying thousands of homes and killing 25 people. Will walked through the rubble of his home. As he stood there surveying the destruction, he was hit with a powerful wave of clarity. He did not care that he had lost all of his possessions. He was just incredibly grateful that his family and his neighbors had survived. As he looked down at the ash at his feet, he noticed a group of ants. Despite the devastating fire, they had survived underground, and they were already busy gathering supplies and rebuilding their colony. This sight gave Will a brilliant idea. He realized that the game he was making should not just be about ants. It should be about how people survive, adapt, and rebuild after tragedies. 9 years later, Will finally released his new video game. But it was not the original game about ants. Instead, inspired by the resilience of those tiny insects in the ruins of his home, he created a game where players could build digital houses, design neighborhoods, and guide characters through simulated lives. But he kept the game realistic by including unpredictable disasters like fires, showing that no matter what happens, you must move forward and rebuild. The game became a massive global success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. All 3 of these incredible stories share a common thread. They show us how fragile our daily lives truly are, and how a single moment can change everything we thought we knew about our future. Whether it is a 13-year-old boy getting lost in the deep wilderness of Yellowstone during a massive storm, or a sick 14-year-old boy facing years of isolation in a hospital bed, or a young software developer watching his entire home turn to ash in a historic firestorm. In each of these situations, it would have been incredibly easy for these individuals to give up. They were facing overwhelming odds, physical danger, and immense emotional pain. But instead of letting despair take over, they kept moving forward, one small step at a time. Cody Clausen relied on his Boy Scout training and kept his calm, leading to a miraculous rescue by one of the most famous Hollywood actors in the world. Richard Starkey found a deep passion for the drums while recovering in a hospital bed, practicing on radiators and tabletops with knitting needles until he eventually became Ringo Starr and joined the most famous rock band in history. And Will Wright watched a resilient colony of ants rebuild in the ruins of his destroyed Oakland home, inspiring him to create a digital universe that would change the entire entertainment industry forever. These stories remind us that life is completely unpredictable, and while we cannot control the disasters that strike us, we can control how we respond to them. The next time you find yourself facing an obstacle that feels completely insurmountable, or a tragedy that seems to tear your world apart, think about these 3 people. Remember the scout in the cave, the boy with his knitting needles, and the developer watching the ants. They show us that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. We just have to keep moving forward, finding the strength to rebuild, and waiting to see what the next chapter has in store for us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.
When we think of missing persons cases, we usually think of a search that ends in a quiet courtroom or a grim discovery in the woods. We think of the police tracking down clues, examining evidence, and trying to reconstruct what happened to someone who simply vanished off the face of the earth. But sometimes the reality of a disappearance is far more complex and unbelievable than any investigator could ever write in a report. Sometimes, when a person goes missing, they are not victims of a crime, but are instead locked in a quiet, desperate battle against the most hostile environments on our planet. Today, we are going to look at three of the most incredible survival stories in human history where search teams looked for clues, found nothing, and officially declared these people dead, only for the missing to pull off the absolute impossible. Our first story begins in the spring of 1994 with a 39-year-old Italian man named Mauro Prosperi. Mauro was an incredibly accomplished police officer from Rome, but he was also a world-class athlete who had competed as an Olympic pentathlete. He was a man who lived for physical challenges, someone who believed that the human body was a machine capable of overcoming any obstacle if you had enough mental discipline. He decided to test this theory by signing up for the Marathon des Sables, which translates to the Marathon of the Sands. This event was widely regarded as the single toughest foot race on the face of the earth. It was a 6-day, 155-mile endurance run straight through the heart of the Sahara Desert in Morocco. The rules of the race were brutal. There were no aid stations with sports drinks or energy gels. Every runner had to carry all of their own food, sleeping gear, medical supplies, and emergency equipment in a heavy backpack. The race organizers only provided a limited amount of fresh water at specific checkpoints along the route, and that was it. The Sahara Desert was so dangerous and unpredictable that before anyone was even allowed to stand at the starting line, they had to sign a very specific document. This document was not just a basic liability waiver. It actually required each participant to write down the exact address where they wanted their body to be shipped in the event that they did not survive the race. To prepare for this terrifying challenge, Mauro had spent months training in a way that most people would find completely insane. He ran 25 miles every single day, often in the peak afternoon heat. To get his body accustomed to the devastating effects of extreme dehydration, he would purposely restrict his water intake during these training runs, forcing himself to keep going on just a few sips of water. He wanted to make sure his mind and body were completely bulletproof before he stepped onto the Saharan sands. But despite his incredible athletic resume and his rigorous preparation, his wife was absolutely terrified. She knew how deadly the Sahara could be, and she begged him to reconsider. But Mauro was confident, even dismissive of the danger. He smiled and told her that the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to him out there was that he would get a little sunburned. The race kicked off at its starting point in Morocco on April 10th, 1994, under a blazing desert sun. Initially, everything went exactly according to Mauro's plan. He was in peak physical condition, easily keeping pace with the frontrunners of the pack. He was consistently the very first Italian runner to cross the finish line at the end of each daily stage. The event felt less like a survival struggle and more like an exciting adventure. Every afternoon, when Mauro would finish his daily run, he would set up his tent, hang an Italian flag outside the entrance, and wait for his fellow Italian competitors to arrive so they could hang out, chat, and drink tea. He would later say that this initial part of the race was actually some of the most fun he had ever had. But the desert has a way of turning on people when they least expect it, and Mauro's luck was about to run out in the most terrifying way possible. On the fourth day of the race, the competitors set out for the longest and most difficult phase of the entire marathon. This was a massive 50-mile stretch of deep sand dunes and barren gravel plains. When Mauro began running that morning, he noticed that the wind was already starting to pick up, blowing fine grains of sand across the track. As the hours passed, the wind grew stronger, and Mauro found himself navigating a narrow valley situated between two massive sand dunes. Because he was running at such a fast pace, the main group of runners had fallen far behind him, and the absolute elite pace setters were miles ahead. Mauro was completely alone in the silent, baking desert. And then, out of nowhere, the wind suddenly intensified into a roaring gale, kicking up a massive sandstorm. Within seconds, a thick wall of swirling yellow dust and sand completely engulfed him, blotting out the sun and reducing his visibility to absolutely zero. Morrow could not see his own hands in front of his face. The tiny, sharp grains of sand whipped against his skin like thousands of miniature needles, and every time he tried to breathe, his lungs filled with dust. He knew that if he kept running, he would easily wander off the path and become hopelessly lost. He managed to grope around in the blinding storm until his hands brushed against a large rock formation. He quickly huddled down behind the rock, pulling his head down, wrapping a scarf tightly around his face, and decided that his best option was simply to wait out the storm. He assumed it would pass in an hour or two, and then he could get right back on the trail and continue his run. But the sandstorm did not stop. It raged violently for 8 consecutive hours, burying Morrow under a thick layer of shifting sand as he lay trapped behind the rock. By the time the wind finally died down and the air cleared, the sun had already set, leaving the desert in pitch-black darkness. At this point, Morrow was not particularly worried about his survival. He was an elite athlete and a police officer trained to handle stress. His biggest concern was actually his placement in the race. He had been in 4th place overall when the storm hit, and he was incredibly frustrated that this massive setback was going to ruin his timing. He went to sleep on the open sand that night, thinking about how he was going to wake up at the very first light of dawn and run as fast as humanly possible to make up for the lost time so he would not finish last. But when the sun rose the next morning, Morrow stood up, looked around, and realized that he had a much bigger problem than his race placement. The sandstorm had been so incredibly powerful that it had completely altered the entire geography of the area. The massive sand dunes that had served as his landmarks the day before had literally shifted and moved, transforming the landscape into a completely unrecognizable sea of sand. Morrow had a compass and a map in his backpack, but they were completely useless to him because he had absolutely no reference points to orient himself. He had no idea which direction he had been running before the storm, and he had no idea where the next checkpoint was. To make matters worse, the race rules required participants to be largely self-sufficient between major checkpoints, meaning Morrow only had a very limited amount of water with him. He had about half a bottle of water left in his pack. The way the race worked was that organizers would distribute fresh bottles of water at each designated checkpoint during the day, with the expectation that runners would drink all of it before reaching the next stop. Because Morrow had been trapped by the storm before reaching the afternoon checkpoint, his water supply was critically low. As he stood there in the quiet desert, Morrow tried to stay calm. He reasoned that other runners must have been caught in the exact same sandstorm. Surely they were also waking up right now, looking around and trying to find their way. He figured all he had to do was find a high vantage point, spot another runner, and they could team up to navigate back to safety. With this plan in mind, Morrow ran up to the crest of a nearby sand dune and scanned the horizon in every direction. But there was nothing. The desert was completely empty, silent, and still. He ran down that dune and sprinted up another one, hoping for a better view. Again, there was only an endless expanse of barren sand. Over the next several hours, Morrow grew increasingly panicked. He spent the hottest hours of the day running from the top of one dune to another, frantically searching for any sign of human life. In doing so, he made a critical mistake. He was sweating profusely under the blazing sun, expending a massive amount of energy and burning through his final drops of water. By late afternoon, with his throat burning and his body trembling from exhaustion, Morrow realized that if he kept running around like this, he was going to die of heat stroke within 24 hours. He stopped, took a deep breath, and forced himself to go into survival mode. He knew that to conserve what little moisture he had left in his body, he had to stop moving during the heat of the day. He decided that from that moment on, he would only travel during the cool hours of the night and the very early morning when the temperature dropped. To prepare for the absolute worst-case scenario, Morrow began urinating into his empty water bottles, saving his own urine to drink later when his fresh water was completely gone. Over the next 2 days, Morrow slowly drifted through the desert, walking in what he hoped was the right direction, but he had no way of knowing if he was making any real progress. He saw nothing but sand, sky, and heat shimmer. His tongue began to swell, and his lips cracked and bled. Then, on the third day of his ordeal, Morrow saw something strange on the horizon. It looked like a small structure. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a mirage, but as he drew closer, he realized it was real. It was a small Muslim shrine, a stone structure built in the middle of the empty desert that nomadic Bedouins would use for shelter as they traveled. Morrow ran inside, desperately hoping to find a living person who could help him. But when he stepped into the dim interior, the only person there was a long-dead holy man resting inside a wooden coffin. Despite the presence of the corpse, Morrow was incredibly relieved. He finally had shelter from the brutal, direct sunlight. He sat down in the shade of the stone walls and took stock of his surroundings. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he looked up at the ceiling and noticed that the wooden rafters of the shrine were completely covered with hundreds of small, sleeping bats. Morrow was starving and dangerously dehydrated. His survival instincts took over. He climbed up into the rafters, reached out, and began grabbing the bats by the handful. He wrung their necks, peeled back their skin, and began drinking their warm blood directly from their bodies to get some form of liquid into his system. He also ate their raw meat. In total, Morrow killed and consumed 20 bats inside that shrine, which gave him just enough strength to keep going. Outside the shrine, Morrow found some dry wood. He decided to build a fire and keep it burning, hoping that the smoke would act as a signal for the search planes and helicopters that he assumed were looking for him. Back at the race headquarters, the organizers had indeed realized that Morrow was missing. They had contacted the Moroccan military, and a massive search operation had been launched. Search parties and off-road vehicles were scouring the desert, and military aircraft were flying patterns over the vast sands. But the Sahara is immense, and finding a single human being in millions of square miles of sand is like finding a needle in a haystack. Over the next 4 days, Morrow stayed at the shrine, keeping his fire going. On 3 separate occasions, he heard the distant sound of an engine and looked up to see a plane or a helicopter flying directly over his location. Each time, Morrow ran outside, waving his arms wildly, screaming at the top of his lungs, and throwing fresh brush onto the fire to create thick plumes of black smoke. But the pilots, flying high above the shimmering desert heat, never saw him. They flew right past, their engines fading into the distance. After the third plane disappeared over the horizon, Morrow fell to his knees in absolute despair. He had been lost in the desert for nearly a week. His food was gone, he was out of water, and he realized that nobody was coming to save him. Faced with the prospect of a slow, agonizing death from dehydration and starvation under the desert sun, Morrow decided to take control of his own fate. He was a practical man, and he wanted to make sure his family was taken care of. He knew that if he died out in the open desert, the shifting sands would quickly cover his body, and he would never be found. If his body was never recovered, the Italian authorities would declare him a missing person, and it would take years for his wife to receive his police pension. But if he died inside the stone shrine, his body would eventually be found by passing Bedouins, providing closure and financial security for his family. Morrow took a piece of charcoal from his signal fire and wrote a long, emotional farewell message to his wife on the stone wall of the shrine. Then he took his knife, cut his wrist deep, and lay down on the dirt floor, closing his eyes and waiting for death to take him. But the next morning, Morrow opened his eyes. He was still alive. He looked down at his wrists and saw that they had barely bled at all. His body was so severely dehydrated that his blood had become incredibly thick and viscous, clotting almost instantly in the wounds and preventing him from bleeding to death. Morrow stared at his wrists in disbelief. He took this as a powerful, unmistakable sign from the universe that he was not meant to die in that desert. He felt a sudden, intense surge of motivation. He was going to survive, no matter what it took. He stood up, packed his gear, and remembered a piece of advice that one of the veteran race organizers had given the runners before the start of the marathon. The organizer had told them that if they ever got hopelessly lost in the desert, they should look toward the horizon at dawn and find the small, low-lying clouds that form there. Those clouds, the organizer said, indicate the presence of moisture and vegetation, and if you follow them, they will eventually lead you to civilization. Morrow looked out at the horizon, spotted a line of faint clouds in the distance, and began walking directly toward them. For days, Morrow marched across the blistering sand dunes. His mind entered a primal, animalistic state focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other. Whenever he saw a lizard or a snake scuttling across the sand, he would pounce on it, kill it, and eat it raw on the spot. His tongue was so swollen and dry that he could no longer produce saliva, making it almost impossible to swallow the dry meat, but he forced it down anyway. When he could no longer urinate, he began searching dried-up riverbeds for wild succulents. He would cut the plants open and suck the bitter, moist sap from their stems. He even resorted to pulling the wet wipes out of his backpack and sucking the chemical moisture out of them just to wet his mouth. On the 9th day of his ordeal, Morrow was shuffling across a gravel plain when he saw a small figure in the distance. As he drew closer, he realized it was a young shepherd girl tending to a small herd of goats. When the girl looked up and saw Morrow, she was absolutely terrified. He looked like a living corpse. His skin was blackened and burned by the sun, his clothes were tattered and covered in dirt, his eyes were sunken deep into his skull, and he had lost over 30 pounds of body weight. The girl screamed and ran away as fast as she could. Morrow was too weak to chase after her, and he sank to the ground, devastated that his one chance at rescue was running away. But the girl had actually run back to her nomadic tribe's camp to tell them about the strange, ghostly man in the desert. A few minutes later, several men from the tribe came riding over the dunes. They wrapped Morrow in blankets, placed him on a camel, and brought him back to their camp. They gently gave him goat's milk and water, nursing him until local authorities could be contacted. When the police finally arrived to pick Morrow up and took him to a hospital, they realized something absolutely shocking. Morrow had walked over 181 miles from where he had originally gotten lost during the race. He had crossed the entire border of Morocco and had walked deep into the territory of neighboring Algeria. Back in Morocco, the search parties had called off their rescue efforts days ago. The only clue they had ever found was a single, discarded shoelace belonging to Morrow, and they had officially concluded that he had perished in the sand. His family was preparing for his funeral when they received the unbelievable phone call that he was alive in an Algerian hospital. It would take Morrow 2 full years of intense medical treatment and physical therapy to fully recover from the damage his organs suffered during those 9 days in the desert. But his spirit was never broken. Once he was fully healed, Morrow returned to the sport he loved, ultimately going on to complete 8 more extreme desert ultramarathons. Our second story of incredible survival takes us away from the hot, dry sands of the Sahara and drops us right into the middle of the vast open water of the Pacific Ocean. The date was November 17th, 2012, and we are off the coast of Chiapas, Mexico. A 35-year-old man named Jose Salvador Alvarenga was preparing for a deep-sea fishing trip. Jose was an incredibly experienced commercial fisherman who had spent years working on the water. He knew how to handle boats, he knew how to read the weather, and he knew exactly where to find the most valuable fish in the deep ocean. On this particular day, Jose had volunteered to take on a grueling 30-hour shift for his fishing company. He was hoping to catch a massive haul of sharks, marlins, and sailfish, which were highly lucrative. Normally, Jose went out to sea with his regular fishing partner, a seasoned professional who could handle any situation. but at the very last minute, his partner had to back out of the trip. Jose was determined to go anyway, so he looked around the docks for anyone else who was willing to work. The only person available was a 23-year-old named Ezekiel Cordoba. Ezekiel was the complete opposite of Jose. He was young, extremely inexperienced, and had never been out on a deep-sea fishing trip before. Jose knew that Ezekiel would not be of much help if things got rough, but he figured that since it was only a short 30-hour trip and they would not be traveling too far from the shoreline, nothing major could go wrong. He agreed to take the young rookie along. The two men climbed aboard Jose's 24-foot fiberglass skiff. The boat was a simple, open-hulled vessel equipped with a small outboard motor, a radio, various fishing lines, and a massive insulated icebox to hold their catch. They pushed off from the Mexican shore and headed out into the ocean. At first, their trip was an absolute success. Within just a few hours of dropping their lines, they hit a massive school of fish. They were pulling in valuable sharks and marlins one after the other, and the giant icebox was quickly filling up to maximum capacity. Their luck was so incredible that they lost track of time. In the late afternoon, Jose noticed a dark line of heavy clouds forming on the horizon, signaling an approaching storm. A seasoned fisherman would normally pack up and head back to port immediately. But Jose and Ezekiel were having the run of their lives, and they decided to wait and catch just a few more fish before heading back. This decision would prove to be a fatal mistake. The storm that was rolling in was not a typical tropical squall. It was a massive, historically violent weather system. By the time Jose finally started up the outboard motor and turned the skiff toward the Mexican coast, the storm was already upon them. The rain began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets, completely obscuring the coastline and reducing their visibility to just a few feet. The wind howled, and the waves quickly grew into towering walls of water that battered the small fiberglass boat. Jose tried to use his compass to navigate, but the wind and currents were too strong. To make matters worse, the skiff was incredibly heavy, loaded down with nearly 1,000 pounds of freshly caught fish. The boat was sitting dangerously low in the water, taking on waves with every passing minute. Realizing they were in imminent danger of sinking, Jose shouted to Ezekiel that they had to lighten the load. Together, they began tossing their valuable catch back into the ocean, watching 1,000 pounds of hard-earned fish disappear into the dark, churning waves. Even with the lightened boat, they could make no progress against the storm. The wind was pushing them further and further away from the safety of the shore. Realizing that fighting the waves was burning through their limited fuel, Jose made the difficult decision to shut down the engine. He told Ezekiel that their best chance of survival was to simply ride out the storm, letting the boat drift until the weather cleared, and then they would use their remaining fuel to navigate back to land. But the storm did not end. It continued to rage with terrifying intensity for 5 straight days. The two men were trapped in a living nightmare. The torrential rain never stopped, the wind screamed, and the boat was constantly tossed up and down by massive waves. They had no shelter on the open skiff, and they were constantly soaked and shivering from the cold. Because they had only planned to be out for 30 hours, they had brought very little food and water, which they quickly exhausted. Fortunately, the heavy rain allowed them to collect some drinking water in empty containers, but they had absolutely nothing to eat. By the time the storm finally broke on the 6th day, the sky cleared to reveal a terrifying reality. They were completely lost in the middle of the vast, empty Pacific Ocean. The damage to their boat was catastrophic. The violent waves had completely ripped the outboard motor off the transom, and it was gone. Their electronics were completely fried by the saltwater, and most of their fishing gear had been swept overboard. The only thing they had left was a small handheld radio. Jose turned it on and realized there was just a tiny bit of battery power left. He quickly broadcasted a frantic mayday message to his boss back on the mainland, giving their last known coordinates and explaining that they were drifting without a motor. But before he could get a confirmation or a response, the radio battery died completely. Back on land, Jose's boss immediately contacted the Mexican authorities and search parties were launched. Helicopters, planes, and rescue boats searched the ocean waters off the coast of Chiapas for several days. But the ocean is vast, and the strong currents had already pulled the light fiberglass skiff far away from the search grid. During the search, rescuers discovered some broken pieces of fiberglass floating in the ocean that matched the color of Jose's boat. Believing the skiff had capsized and disintegrated in the historic storm, the authorities called off the search. The families of Jose and Ezekiel were notified that the men were lost at sea and presumed dead. Memorial services were held and the community mourned their tragic passing. But out on the open ocean, the two men were still very much alive, drifting slowly westward. As the days turned into weeks, they had to quickly adapt to their new, hostile environment. Jose's lifetime of fishing experience became their greatest asset. He figured out how to use his bare hands to catch small sea turtles that swam near the boat. He would lean over the side, grab them by their shells, and haul them aboard. They would crack the shells open, eat the raw meat, and drink the warm turtle blood, which provided them with crucial hydration and nutrients. Jose also learned to catch small fish that hid under the shadow of the boat, and he would grab seabirds that landed on the skiff's edges, wringing their necks and eating them raw. Whenever it rained, they would collect the water in empty containers, but during the long, dry spells, they had to resort to drinking their own urine and turtle blood to survive. Jose tried his best to stay positive, constantly telling Ezekiel that they would eventually drift into a shipping lane and be spotted by a commercial cargo ship, or that they would eventually hit land. He kept track of the passage of time by carefully monitoring the cycles and phases of the moon, scratching marks into the side of the boat. But while Jose was mentally tough and adapted to the brutal routine, young Ezekiel was completely falling apart. He had never been out on the ocean like this, and the constant movement of the boat, the blazing sun, and the horrific diet of raw meat and blood began to take a severe psychological toll on him. He fell into a state of profound catatonic depression. By the 4th month of their drift, Ezekiel's body began to reject the raw turtle and bird meat. Every time he tried to swallow a piece, he would immediately become violently ill, throwing up what little moisture he had left. He grew weaker by the day, and eventually, he simply gave up. He refused to eat, despite Jose's desperate pleas and attempts to force feed him. In early 2013, Ezekiel Cordoba closed his eyes and died of starvation and dehydration. Ezekiel's death was a crushing blow to Jose. Even though the young man had not been able to help with the physical survival tasks, his presence had kept Jose sane. He was someone to talk to, someone to share the burden of their terrifying reality. Now, Jose was completely alone in the middle of the infinite ocean. He fell into a deep, dark depression. For 6 consecutive days, Jose could not bring himself to touch Ezekiel's body. He simply sat on the opposite side of the small skiff, staring at his deceased friend, talking to him as if he were still alive. He even contemplated jumping overboard to end his own life. But on the 7th day, a sudden wave of clarity washed over Jose. He realized that if he did not dispose of the body, it would begin to decay and bring disease, ending his own chances of survival. He stood up, said a quiet prayer of farewell, and gently pushed Ezekiel's body into the deep blue water of the Pacific. From that moment on, Jose became laser-focused on one thing: survival. He spent his days catching birds, tracking the moon, and conserving his energy. He would survive like this, completely alone in the open ocean, for another 9 grueling months. Then, on January 30th, 2014, after drifting for an unbelievable 14 months and traveling over 6,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, Jose looked out and saw a tiny sliver of green on the horizon. It was land. He had drifted all the way to the remote Ibon Atoll, a tiny part of the Marshall Islands. Weak, emaciated, and barely able to stand, Jose managed to steer his boat close to the reef, leaped into the water, and swam ashore. He stumbled onto a beach and saw a small wooden hut. He knocked on the door, and a local couple opened it to find a wild-looking man with long matted hair, a thick beard, and wearing nothing but a tattered pair of underwear. The couple was absolutely stunned. They took him in, gave him water and food, and contacted the local authorities. Word quickly spread around the world that a Mexican fisherman had just washed up on a remote island after being lost at sea for over a year. When Jose's family in Mexico received the news, they were in absolute disbelief. They had spent over a year mourning his death, and now he was suddenly alive on the other side of the planet. But when Jose returned to Mexico, his incredible story of survival was met with an unexpected wave of skepticism and suspicion. Many people, including several journalists and medical experts, openly accused him of fabricating the entire ordeal. They pointed out that when he was first rescued, he did not look like someone who had been starving on a boat for 14 months. He was somewhat heavy, and his skin was not as severely damaged as they expected. Furthermore, they argued that it was medically impossible for a human to survive that long without developing scurvy, a deadly disease caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, which is found in fresh fruits and vegetables. However, medical experts who thoroughly examined Jose quickly debunked these claims. They explained that a diet consisting entirely of raw sea turtles, fish, and seabirds actually contains high levels of vitamin C, particularly in the eyes, livers, and blood of the animals, which Jose had consumed. This unique diet had kept scurvy at bay. Additionally, oceanographers and researchers at the University of Hawaii ran a series of advanced computer simulations using historical wind and current data from late 2012 to early 2014. The results were clear. An unpowered boat drifting from the coast of Mexico would be carried by the North Equatorial Current directly to the Marshall Islands, exactly where Jose had washed ashore. The most painful challenge for Jose came when the family of Ezequiel Cordoba filed a massive lawsuit against him. They accused Jose of murdering their son and eating his body to survive those 14 months at sea. They claimed that this was the only logical explanation for how Jose had managed to stay so well nourished while their son had supposedly starved to death. Jose was deeply hurt by these accusations, as he had tried everything in his power to save the young man. To prove his innocence, Jose agreed to undergo multiple comprehensive lie detector tests administered by independent forensic experts. He passed every single test with physical indicators proving his absolute honesty, confirming that he had never harmed Ezequiel and had only disposed of his body after he had naturally passed away. Today, Jose lives a quiet, isolated life in a small, landlocked town in El Salvador. He refuses to go anywhere near the ocean, terrified of the vast blue water that kept him prisoner for over a year. Our third and final story of survival takes us to the skies above South America and then deep into the dense, dark interior of the Amazon rainforest. The date was December 24th, 1971, and a 17-year-old German girl named Juliane Kepke was standing in the busy airport terminal in Lima, Peru. Juliane had just graduated from high school, and she was traveling with her mother, Maria. They were waiting to board a flight to the jungle city of Pucallpa, where Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm Kopke, was waiting for them. Her father was a famous zoologist who ran a remote research station deep in the Amazon, and the family was looking forward to spending Christmas together. The airport was completely packed with holiday travelers, and everyone was incredibly frustrated because their flight, Lanza Flight 508, was running over 7 hours late. The delay was caused by severe, turbulent weather conditions over the Andes Mountains, which made flying extremely dangerous. Many passengers were complaining and demanding refunds, but Juliane and her mother were just anxious to get home, so they decided to wait. Finally, the flight was cleared for departure, and the passengers boarded the Lockheed Electra turboprop aircraft. Shortly after takeoff, the plane began to encounter moderate turbulence as it climbed into the cloudy Peruvian sky. Juliane, who had flown many times before, actually found the gentle shaking of the plane to be somewhat exciting. Her mother, however, was highly nervous, gripping the armrest tightly with white knuckles. As the plane flew higher, heading directly into a massive active thunderstorm, the turbulence grew progressively worse. Within minutes, the aircraft was being violently tossed around like a toy in the sky. The shaking became so intense that the overhead luggage compartments burst open, sending heavy suitcases, wrapped Christmas presents, and holiday cakes tumbling down into the aisle, causing passengers to scream in terror. Julianne's excitement quickly turned to absolute dread. She looked out the window and saw brilliant, blinding flashes of lightning illuminating the dark storm clouds right next to the wings. The plane felt like it was being lifted 50 feet in the air and then suddenly dropped into a free fall over and over again. And then there was an incredibly loud, metallic bang that echoed through the cabin, accompanied by a blinding flash of light that turned the entire interior of the plane stark white. Instantly, all the cabin lights went out, plunging the passengers into darkness. Julianne looked out the left window and saw thick black smoke and bright orange flames pouring out of the engine on the wing. The plane entered a steep, near-vertical nosedive, screaming toward the earth at hundreds of miles per hour. Amidst the deafening roar of the engines and the terrified screams of 90 passengers, Julianne's mother turned to her, grabbed her hand tightly, and whispered her final words. "This is it. It's all over." The next thing Julianne knew, the chaotic noise of the cabin vanished. It was replaced by a strange, rushing sound of wind. She opened her eyes and realized she was no longer inside the airplane. She was outside, suspended in the air, still strapped securely to her row of 3 passenger seats. The plane had disintegrated in mid-air at an altitude of over 2 miles. Julianne was in a state of freefall, plummeting 10,000 feet toward the dense canopy of the Amazon jungle below. She watched the green tops of the trees rushing up to meet her, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound loneliness as she fell through the sky. And then she lost consciousness. When Julianne woke up the next day, she was lying on the wet jungle floor. She looked up at the sky through a small gap in the thick canopy above, and the very first words she spoke out loud were, "I survived." She tried to stand, but her body was in immense pain. She had suffered a broken collarbone, a concussion, a deep bleeding gash in her leg, and a swollen, blackened eye. She had also lost her glasses during the fall, and because she was extremely nearsighted, the entire jungle around her was a blurry green haze. She was wearing only a sleeveless summer mini dress, and she had lost one of her flip-flops during the fall. She began shouting for her mother, her voice echoing through the dense forest. But there was no reply, only the chatter of birds and insects. She was completely alone. Back in Lima, when Flight 508 disappeared from military radar, a massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched. Over the next several days, dozens of search planes and helicopters flew patterns over the vast, dense Amazon rainforest, trying to locate the crash site. But the triple canopy jungle of the Amazon is so incredibly thick and overgrown that it acted like a giant green blanket, completely hiding the wreckage from the air. The pilots could see nothing but endless treetops. Ground search teams tried to cut their way through the thick jungle, but the terrain was so hostile, filled with swamps and steep terrain, that progress was agonizingly slow. The authorities eventually began to lose hope, believing that all 91 passengers had died on impact and that the jungle had swallowed them whole. But Julianne was determined to live. She had a major advantage that most teenagers did not. She had spent the last year and a half living with her parents at their remote Amazonian research station. Her parents had taught her the vital rules of jungle survival. She knew that the most important thing she had to do was find water. Her father had once told her that if you ever get lost in the jungle, you must find a stream, follow it to a larger river, and eventually that river will lead you to civilization. Julianne found her single remaining flip-flop and placed it on her foot. Because she could not see clearly, she used her bare foot to feel for tree roots and mud, while using her foot with the flip-flop to test the ground ahead of her for venomous snakes or hidden sinkholes before taking a step. She began crawling and stumbling through the thick undergrowth until she heard the faint, beautiful sound of trickling water. She followed the sound and discovered a tiny stream. Instead of walking along the muddy banks of the stream, which were covered in dense foliage, thorns, and fallen logs, Julianne stepped directly into the water and began wading down the middle of the stream. Her parents had taught her that predators like jaguars, wild boars, and venomous spiders are much more likely to hunt and hide on the banks, and that walking in the water was far safer even if it meant dealing with piranhas and stingrays. A short distance down the stream, Julianne came across a small section of the plane's wreckage. It was a piece of the fuselage, but there were no survivors there. The only useful thing she found was a small plastic bag of hard candy. She took the bag, popped a candy into her mouth, and kept walking. For several days, Julianne slowly made her way down the winding stream. The daytime heat was oppressive, and the air was thick with clouds of biting mosquitoes and flies that swarmed her open wounds. At night, the temperature dropped, and because she was wearing only a thin mini dress, she would shiver uncontrollably on the damp ground, unable to sleep. She would later say that the nights were the most terrifying part of her ordeal as she lay in pitch-black darkness, listening to the strange roaring cries of unknown predators moving through the trees around her. On the fourth day of her journey, Julianne heard a sound that made her heart stop. It was the loud, heavy flapping of wings and the harsh, guttural croaking of a king vulture. Having lived in the jungle, she knew exactly what that sound meant. King vultures only gather when there is a large amount of decaying meat nearby. She knew that just around the next bend of the stream lay the bodies of her fellow passengers, and she was terrified that she was about to find her own mother. She slowly rounded the corner and saw a horrific sight. A row of 3 passenger seats had landed headfirst in the soft mud with such immense force that the bodies of the passengers were buried chest deep in the earth with only their legs sticking out into the air. Julianne approached the wreckage, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and grief. She examined the feet of one of the female passengers, looking to see if it was her mother. She noticed that the woman's toenails were painted a bright pink. Julianne knew that her mother never painted her toenails, and she felt an immediate, overwhelming wave of relief that this corpse was not her mother. But almost instantly, she felt a deep sense of shame and guilt for feeling happy in the presence of such tragedy. She searched the area for food or supplies, but found nothing. She said a silent prayer for the dead and continued her journey down the stream. By the 10th day, Julianne's physical condition had deteriorated dangerously. She had finished her bag of candy days ago and had not eaten anything since. Her broken collarbone throbbed with every step, and the deep gash on her leg had become severely infected. But the most horrifying development was a wound on her right arm. A blowfly had laid eggs in the open cut, and the wound was now completely infested with dozens of live, crawling maggots that were eating her flesh. She was so weak that she could no longer walk, so she allowed herself to drift with the current of the river, which had grown wider and deeper. As she floated down the river, she suddenly saw something that she thought was a hallucination caused by her fever and starvation. Up on the muddy bank sat a large wooden boat with an outboard motor attached to it. Julianne slowly swam to the bank, dragged herself out of the water, and touched the side of the boat. It was real. She looked up and saw a small, narrow pathway leading from the boat into the jungle. She dragged herself up the path and found a small, empty wooden hut used by local lumbermen. Inside the hut, Julianne found a small plastic jug containing gasoline. She remembered a time back at her parents' research station when their dog had developed a maggot infestation in a wound, and her father had used gasoline to successfully extract them. Julianne poured the harsh burning fuel directly into the deep wound on her arm. She screamed in agony as the gasoline burned her raw flesh, but the chemical reaction forced the maggots to crawl to the surface of her skin. With her remaining strength, Julianne painstakingly pulled 30 large maggots out of her arm one by one. Exhausted and in excruciating pain, she crawled onto the floor of the hut and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Julianne woke up to the sound of human voices. She looked toward the doorway and saw 3 Peruvian forest workers walking up the path. When the men saw Julianne, they stopped in their tracks, paralyzed with fear. Julianne was incredibly pale, with long blonde hair, and she was wearing a tattered, dirty dress. The local men believed in a famous jungle legend about a water goddess, a half-woman, half-mermaid spirit who was pale-skinned and would lure men to their deaths in the river. They thought they were looking at a ghost. Julianne spoke to them in perfect Spanish, explaining that she was a human, a passenger from the plane that had crashed a week and a half ago, and that she desperately needed help. The men immediately realized she was telling the truth. They washed her wounds, gave her some food and clean water, and let her rest. The following day, they placed her in their boat and took her on a several-hour journey down the river to a small local town, where she was rushed to a clinic. The very next day, Julianne was reunited with her father, who had traveled to the area to join the search efforts. When he walked into her hospital room, he was so completely overwhelmed with emotion, having believed his entire family was dead, that he simply collapsed by her bed and could not speak for hours. Julianne was the sole survivor of the 91 people who had boarded Lanza Flight 508 on Christmas Eve. A few weeks after her rescue, search teams finally located the main crash site deep in the jungle. There, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Julianne's mother had actually survived the initial 2-mile fall as well, landing in a different part of the forest with severe injuries. But because she was unable to move and the search planes could not see through the thick canopy, she had survived for several agonizing days alone in the dark before finally succumbing to her wounds. This tragic detail would haunt Julianne and her father for the rest of their lives, leaving them with the painful knowledge of how close they had come to saving her. Julianne recovered from her physical injuries and went on to study biology, just like her parents. But she would always carry the heavy, silent burden of being the girl who fell from the sky and survived the green hell of the Amazon. These 3 incredible stories of survival remind us of the sheer, unbreakable power of the human spirit. In the face of absolute despair, when all hope of rescue had vanished, these individuals did not give up. They adapted, they fought, and they found a way to make it back to the world. Their experiences show us that sometimes the line between life and death is not just a matter of luck, but a matter of pure, unyielding will. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Imagine you are entering a place that time has completely forgotten, and you are walking through the doors that are heavy and quiet. Almost all of us experience an immediate feeling of unease whenever we consider the possibility of entering a building that has been abandoned. Our minds conjure up images of shadowy nooks and crannies, floorboards that creak, and the chilly, lingering sensation of being watched by something that is not visible. However, a man by the name of Dan Bell does not feel threatened by these voids in the environment. These locations hold a wealth of history, a peaceful memory, and a beauty that has been long forgotten. Dan is a very well-known creator who maintains a page that is followed by a large number of people. On this page, he shares his adventures in abandoned locations. Over the course of several years, he has invested in the development of a massive community consisting of more than 500,000 subscribers who tune in on a regular basis to watch him explore these abandoned buildings. While other people who explore these kinds of places are looking for cheap scares or sensational drama, Dan is not looking for either of those things. The use of dramatic music is not something he employs, and he does not attempt to create creepy moments for viewers to experience. The majority of his most popular videos, on the other hand, are shot in locations that have not even been completely abandoned before. Take, for instance, one of his most cherished videos, which is a peaceful stroll through a massive Kmart department store that is in the process of closing down. The shelves are completely devoid of any items, the cash registers are silent, and the aisles are completely empty as they stretch out under the fluorescent lights that are buzzing. In spite of the fact that it is a profoundly nostalgic and slightly eerie look at a location that is Nevertheless, there is one upload that is absolutely terrifying, and it is located on his page, which contains a lot of videos that are either peaceful or nostalgic. A video with the title, "The Super Creepy Abandoned Asylum," you can watch here. Due to the fact that the video is so unsettling, even other urban explorers with years of experience were deeply disturbed by it. The fact of the matter is that one of the most prominent comments on the video comes from a verified account that is highly regarded and has more than 1 million subscribers. In their writing, they express the possibility that this was the most unsettling urban exploration video they had ever witnessed in their entire lives. The first scene of the video shows Dan approaching a massive old structure that is in a state of disrepair and is located deep within the forest. If you were to look at this building from the outside, you would never be able to tell that it was an institution. The appearance of the structure is that of a massive old residential house that has been completely consumed by nature over the course of many years. Verdant vines that are thick and green climb up the brick walls, wrapping themselves around the windows and reaching up toward the roof. In the area surrounding the perimeter, the grass has become so overgrown that it reaches all the way up to Dan's waist. Despite the fact that it is a bright and sunny afternoon, the trees are dense and close together, which causes them to cast shadows that are strong and dark over the property. There is not a single word that Dan utters throughout the first minute and a half of the video. He does nothing more than stroll around the exterior of the building in a low-key manner, allowing the camera to capture the oppressive and hushed atmosphere of the forest. The only sounds that can be heard are the soft crunch of dirt and dry leaves beneath his boots, the occasional chirping of birds, and the gentle rustling of the leaves as they are blown by the wind. Despite the fact that it is extremely tranquil, there is a sense of tension that is building up with each step that the person takes. Dan makes his way to the side of the building after he has spent approximately 1 minute and a half exploring the entire exterior of the building. When he gets there, he sees a set of stone steps that are quite old and cracked, and they lead down into the ground. It is abundantly clear that the basement of the building can be reached through the heavy, weathered wooden door that is located at the bottom of these steps. After descending the stairs, Dan reaches out and opens the door for the visitor. The video goes through a significant visual transformation as soon as he enters the room. While the sunlight was extremely bright and intense outside, the darkness that prevailed inside the basement was completely devoid of any light. The sudden shift in light causes his camera lens to take an entire minute to adjust and focus on the environment. This is because of the sudden change in light. When the camera is finally able to adjust, the scene that is revealed can be described as extremely unsettling. You notice a lengthy corridor that is particularly narrow and extends into the darkness. It appears as though the paint on the walls is flaking off in enormous sheets of paper that are hanging down like cobwebs. The floor is completely cluttered with heaps of old, moldy clothing, trash that is scattered all over the place, and paper that is deteriorating. If you listen carefully, you can hear the loud and sharp crunch of broken glass beneath Dan's heavy boots as he begins to walk down this hallway. When Dan was first filming this exploration, he did not speak out loud at any point. He desired to maintain his silence so that he could pay attention to his surroundings and ensure his own safety. Rather than that, he made the decision to record a voiceover narration to explain the history of the building while he was back at home editing the video. The starting point for this voiceover is precisely when his camera focuses on the dimly lit hallway in the basement. This building was actually a children's asylum that had been closed down and shut down sometime in the 90s, according to Dan, who explains this information in a calm and steady voice. At the beginning of the 21st century, he mentions that the building was rented out to a private tenant for a brief period of time. However, for the most part, the structure had been completely vacant and abandoned for close to 30 years. Decomposition had been allowed to take place, with the damp air and the forest that surrounded it gradually reclaiming it. Dan suddenly pauses after he has finished sharing this brief history, which he does in a tone that is very casual and has been carefully practiced. While he was inside the building on that particular day, he experienced something that he describes as being extremely peculiar and unsettling. He mentions this to his audience. He heard the distinct and unmistakable sound of someone running around on the very top floor of the structure while he was walking through the lower levels of the building. After all, Dan had spent his entire life inside dozens of buildings that had been abandoned. He was very accustomed to the sights and sounds of deserted locations, and he was aware that wild animals, birds, and other stray creatures frequently made their homes within these peaceful ruins. The sound of a bird, a raccoon, or a squirrel moving around was something that was heard quite frequently. Therefore, his obvious and reasonable assumption was that there had to be some kind of animal running across the floorboards in the upper level of the building. It did not appear to be a source of significant concern for him. After making the decision to maintain his composure, he completed the filming of his tour of the first floor and then slowly made his way up the stairs in order to investigate the upper level. When Dan finally made it to the top floor, he anticipated getting a glimpse of some tangible evidence of whatever it was that had been making that noise. Among the things he looked for were animal droppings, dust that had been disturbed on the floor, and a nest that was concealed in one of the rooms. On the other hand, as he moved from one room to the next, he encountered nothing but complete and utter silence. The rooms were completely silent, devoid of any activity, and covered in a thick layer of dust that had not been disturbed. There were no indications of any kind of life whatsoever, and everything appeared to be exactly the same as the rest of the abandoned building. With a sense of contentment that the sound must have been that of a bird that had already departed, Dan completed the recording of the footage he desired, gathered his camera equipment, and then exited the building. After getting into his vehicle and driving home, he did not give the mysterious running sounds much more thought he had been thinking about. His stomach dropped completely when he sat down at his computer, loaded the raw footage from his SD card, and started going through it frame by frame. Only then did he feel a sense of relief. He became aware of the fact that he had not been the only person present in that children's asylum as he watched the video on his enormous monitor. In point of fact, he had been sharing the dark and empty building with another individual who was actively hiding in the shadows and watching his every move. Dan started to conjecture that perhaps a person who had previously been a patient at the asylum, or a person who was on the move, had taken up residence in one of the hidden rooms located on the upper floor. After taking a closer look at the video, he was able to pinpoint two distinct and unsettling instances in which the phantom figure was captured on camera. In the first video, you will need to pay close attention to a door that is open and that leads directly to the staircase that is located in the basement. During the time that Dan is filming the dark spaces that surround him in the hallway, a distinct shadow is being cast onto the surface of the door. A person who is standing just out of the camera's line of sight, right at the top of the stairs, and looking down at Dan is clearly the source of this shadow. As the shadow is silhouetted against the weathered wood of the door, it remains perfectly still for a number of seconds. At that moment, as Dan pans his camera back down the hallway, the shadow suddenly and silently disappears, indicating that the individual had quietly slipped down the stairs deeper into the darkness of the basement and directly toward where Dan was filming. The second video is even more upsetting than the first. As Dan enters one of the rooms on the upper floor, he starts to move his camera around the room in order to capture the entire area. There is an old wooden door inside the room, and it is located in the back left corner of the space. If you look at the door very carefully, specifically at the small hole that is empty where the doorknob used to be, you will be able to see a human eye looking right through the hole. Dan was being observed by a person who was standing on the opposite side of that door, pressing themselves against the wood and looking through the small opening to observe his movements. The individual on the other side of the door becomes aware that they have been observed the moment the camera focuses its attention directly on the door. There is a sudden and frantic motion that causes the shadow that is behind the hole to shift, and you hear a faint sound of them running away down the corridor on the other side of the hole. There are times when the most dangerous thing in an abandoned building is not the deteriorating structure itself, but rather the living people who continue to haunt the halls of the building. This is a reminder that is deeply haunting. Our next story involves a woman who went to a very familiar and safe place in her community only to run into a nightmare that she would never be able to escape from. While Dan Bell was fortunate enough to walk out of that abandoned asylum completely unharmed, our next story involves a woman who went to a place that she knew it was safe. Missy Beavers was a woman whose life was characterized by vitality, love, and a profound devotion to her family and her community. However, her story would ultimately culminate in one of the most perplexing and unsettling unsolved crimes in recent memory. This is the story of Missy Beavers. The woman who lived in Midlothian, Texas, was known as Missy Beavers, and she was 45 years old. Just to the south of the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area is where you'll find the tranquil and peaceful suburb of Midlothian. The town is the kind of close-knit community in which residents are familiar with one another, children are able to play in the streets without fear of harm, and violent crime is extremely uncommon. Brandon was a devoted husband to Missy, and she was a loving mother to their 3 beautiful daughters. Missy was a devoted wife to Brandon. In addition to that, she was one of the most successful and enthusiastic fitness instructors. The local fitness boot camp that Missy ran was called Camp Gladiator, and it was a high-intensity workout program that she taught first thing in the morning. Missy was the kind of person who lived life to the fullest possible extent. At the same time that she was extremely bubbly, optimistic, and outgoing, she possessed a natural ability to motivate and inspire everyone who was in her immediate vicinity. When it came to social media, where she was an exceptionally active user of Facebook, her lively personality was especially noticeable. Throughout the day, she would post multiple times, sharing updates about her life, including her daily workout routines, her healthy meal routines, and photos of her family vacations. In order to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to participate in her fitness class, Missy made sure to post her personal cell phone number on her public Facebook page. This allowed anyone who was interested in enrolling in her class to get in touch with her via direct message. In addition to the fact that she had nothing to conceal, she was always willing to accept new people into her life. On the evening of Sunday, April 17th, 26, Missy was getting ready for her regular Monday morning boot camp class, which was planning to take place at 5 o'clock the following morning. The class was scheduled to take place the following day. As the evening progressed, however, local weather reports started forecasting severe heavy rainstorms and thunderstorms for the early morning hours of Monday. These forecasts were made for the early morning hours. As a result of the fact that the class was typically held outside, Missy's phone started to ring with calls and text messages from her students. All of them were curious about whether or not the class would be canceled due to the inclement weather this morning. Missy made the decision to address the situation by publishing a public post on her Facebook page at 7:55 that evening. This was due to the fact that a large number of people had reached out to her. She sent a message to her students in which she informed them that even if it was raining, they were still training and that there were no excuses because they were gladiators. She explained that because of the rain, they would be moving the class indoors inside the Creekside Church of Christ, which was situated in Midlothian within a short distance of the main highway. She provided the precise address of the church, the start time of 5 o'clock, as well as instructions on what kinds of equipment she expected attendees to bring. A little later that evening, at 9:23, she made one last post, in which she stated that she was going to bed because she had to get ready for the next day at 3:30 in the morning. Missy's alarm went off at 3:30 the following morning, which was Monday, April 18th. Today is Monday. It was pouring rain when she drove her white pickup truck through the pitch-black night toward the Creekside Church of Christ. She got out of bed, put on her workout clothes, and then traveled. An image of her truck pulling into the parking lot of the church was captured by a security camera that was located on the opposite side of the street at 4:16 in the morning. As much as possible, Missy would arrive at her classes early. In order to be enthusiastic and welcoming when her first students walked through the door, she wanted to have plenty of time to carry her equipment inside, set up the classroom, turn on the lights, and do a quick warm-up. She wanted to be ready for them. It was 4:20 in the morning when the security cameras located within the lobby of the church caught Missy walking through the front doors, carrying her belongings, and making her way down the hallway in the direction of the designated classroom. When the first couple of students arrived at the church for the class, it was just before 5 o'clock in the morning. They had just gotten out of their cars and were running into the building as the rain continued to fall heavily. With the expectation that they would find Missy preparing the classroom and playing upbeat music, they made their way through the lobby and then proceeded down the hallway toward the classroom. The reality was that they were confronted with a horrifying scene as soon as they entered the room. Missy was lying on the ground, unresponsive, and heavily bleeding from severe wounds to her head. Her injuries were critical. Students who were taken aback immediately dialed the number 911. Despite the fact that emergency medical technicians and law enforcement officers rushed to the church, as soon as they arrived and examined her, they realized that there was nothing they could do to help her. At the scene, Missy was certified as having passed away. In the beginning, there was some kind of speculation that Missy might have been the victim of a tragic accident. This was due to the fact that the room was dark and the discovery was made so suddenly. It was speculated by the investigators that she had injured her head on the hard concrete floor after falling and tripping over some equipment that was located in the dark. However, after the arrival of the medical examiner and the completion of a more thorough examination, they immediately ruled out the possibility of an accident. A number of deep puncture wounds had been purposefully and violently inflicted on Missy's head and chest. These wounds were present throughout her body. It could not be denied that she had been repeatedly struck by a blunt object that was both heavy and blunt. The building was immediately secured by the police, and they immediately began an exhaustive investigation, beginning with the footage from the private security cameras located within the church. As soon as they watched the video, they were completely and utterly shocked by what they saw. Later that morning, at precisely 3:50, which was 26 minutes before Missy even pulled into the parking lot, the security cameras revealed that an unknown person had broken into the church through a side door. This occurred earlier than Missy had even pulled into the parking lot. Heavy, professional police tactical gear covered this individual from head to toe. They were dressed in full uniform. They wore a dark hood or mask that completely obscured their face, a heavy tactical helmet that was black in color, a heavy ballistic vest that had the word police printed across the front in bold letters, heavy tactical gloves, and shin guards. This masked figure slowly and casually strolled up and down the empty hallways of the church for 30 minutes, beginning at 3:50 in the morning and continuing until Missy walked through the doors at 4:20. A pry bar or a hammer was the heavy instrument that they were carrying in their hand, according to the investigators who were looking into the matter. The killer's remarkably calm and unconcerned demeanor was the major factor that contributed to the footage's profoundly unsettling nature. We did not get the impression that they were anxious, nor did we get the impression that they were in a hurry. As they made their way through the corridors, it was almost as if they were going for a peaceful stroll in a park. Occasionally, as they passed a door leading to a classroom, they would pause, turn their attention to the glass window that was located on the door, and then use their instrument to casually break the glass from the window. Once that was over, they would simply turn around and proceed to walk down the hall as if nothing had really occurred. They did not go into the rooms at any point in order to look for valuables. The individuals in question did not break into the church office with the intention of stealing money, nor did they steal any of the costly electronic equipment or sound systems that were openly displayed in the sanctuary. Upon further investigation, the police were able to confirm that the church had not been the victim of any thefts. The findings of the investigation revealed a significant finding after the investigators analyzed this behavior. Both the act of vandalizing the church and the act of committing a robbery were not the intentions of this individual who was present. As if they were merely attempting to kill time, they were breaking the glass windows, which gave the impression that they were doing so out of sheer boredom. In spite of the fact that they appeared to have a very particular and singular purpose for being present at the church that morning, they were unable to carry out their plan at that time. They were awaiting the activation of a cause. In addition, the moment that Missy Beavers entered the building at precisely 4:20 in the morning was the moment that the trigger was executed. Shortly after Missy entered the building, the murderer became aware of her presence. According to the surveillance footage, the masked individual turned around and moved in the direction of the location where Missy was preparing to act. They followed her into the classroom, surrounded her, and then used the heavy tool to brutally beat her to death that they had discovered. In the time it took for the police to arrive, which was a little after 5 o'clock, the murderer had already escaped the building through a back exit and disappeared into the wet morning. He had not left any physical evidence, fingerprints, or DNA behind. At first, the authorities were under the impression that determining who the murderer was would be a relatively simple task. The security footage captured the individual's physical movements in high definition, despite the fact that the mask and helmet completely concealed the individual's face. The murderer walked in a manner that was incredibly unique and recognizable. A very noticeable swinging waddle was created by them as they walked, because they walked with a very pronounced slouch. Their shoulders were rounded forward, and their feet turned significantly outward as they took steps. In addition to this, it appeared as though they walked with a slight limp that remained from side to side. The authorities were confident that this one-of-a-kind physical gait was so easily recognizable that anyone who knew this individual in real life would be able to recognize them without any difficulty. In the hopes of achieving a speedy breakthrough, the police made the decision to make the surveillance footage available to the general public. The video made its way onto national news broadcasts and was widely shared across social media platforms in a short amount of time. Within a matter of hours, the Midlothian Police Department received hundreds of tips from the public. Many individuals from different parts of the country called in to say that they were familiar with the walk. They pointed the finger at people in their immediate vicinity, including family members, co-workers, acquaintances, and neighbors who walked with a limp or an outward turn of their feet. The investigators spent a considerable amount of time following up on each and every one of these leads. The investigation included conducting hundreds of interviews, searching homes, analyzing data from cell phone towers, and verifying alibis. However, the problem was that they thoroughly investigated every single suspect, but in the end, they were unable to identify any of them. At the time of the murder, every single person had a reliable and verifiable alibi that placed them in a location that was relatively far from the church. There have been a lot of different hypotheses proposed over the years regarding the reasons why Missy was targeted. There was a question among some individuals as to whether or not it was a targeted attack, possibly connected to her personal life or someone she had met through her constant presence on social media. Others speculated that the murderer might have misidentified her as someone else, or that it might have been a chance encounter with a deeply troubled person who had made the decision to commit a crime while dressed in tactical gear. On the other hand, the police have never been able to make an arrest because they do not have any tangible evidence. To this day, the mystery surrounding Missy Bevers has not been concluded in any way. Her husband, her 3 daughters, and the community of Midlothian are still left with the agonizing questions of who that masked figure was and why they were waiting in the dark hallways of the church on that rainy morning. These questions have not been answered. While the person responsible for the murder of Missy Bevers continues to remain concealed behind a mask and a cold, unsolved file, our third story transports us to a case in which the perpetrator was not only apprehended, but it was revealed to be an elderly woman whose pleasant and harmless appearance concealed a lifetime of unimaginable horror. Tamara Samsonova is the subject of this narrative. She is a woman who would later become known by a terrifying nickname, and the secrets that she would reveal would shock the entire nation of Russia. In March of the year 2015, our story begins in the stunning and historically significant city of St. Petersburg, which is located in Russia. The life of Tamara Samsonova, a retired woman of 68 years of age, was characterized by a low-key and unassuming existence within her apartment. In the spring of that year, Tamara made the decision to have her house undergo a significant amount of renovation and repair work. She needed to find a place to stay for a few weeks because the construction was going to be noisy, dusty, and make her apartment temporarily unlivable. She needed to find a place to stay. An acquaintance of hers who has known her for a very long time, Valentina Olenova, who is now 79 years old, became aware of Tamara's predicament. A woman who lived alone in a cozy apartment in the neighborhood, Valentina was known for her generosity and kindness. She made contact with Tamara and told her that she would be willing to let her move in with her until the renovations on her apartment were finished in their entirety. Tamara was so moved by the generosity of her friend that she accepted the offer without hesitation. She then proceeded to pack her belongings and move into Valentina's residence. Due to the fact that Tamara was staying in the apartment without paying rent, she wanted to make sure that she was contributing as much as she could in order to demonstrate her love and gratitude. After she moved in, she immediately began taking care of the chores around the house. In addition to washing the windows, sweeping the floors, and doing the dishes, she ensured that the apartment was spotless from top to bottom. Additionally, she made it a point to prepare delectable and hot meals for Valentina on a daily basis, as well as to take care of all the chores in the kitchen and going grocery shopping. The initial arrangement was flawless in every way. At the same time that the 2 elderly women took pleasure in each other's company, Valentina was relieved to have the additional assistance around the house. For the 2 of them, it appeared to be a wonderful and peaceful living situation. Nevertheless, after a few weeks had passed, the entirety of the renovations that had been done on Tamara's apartment were finished, and her house was prepared for her to return. But the issue was that Tamara did not wish to depart from the situation. She was beginning to develop a strong affection for living with Valentina, and she took pleasure in the convenience of the apartment as well as the daily routine that they had established together. She made a promise to Valentina that she would not be a burden, and she asked Valentina if she could stay some more time than she had planned. Valentina was a little bit hesitant before agreeing to let Tamara stay for a little while longer because she valued her privacy and her quiet, solitary lifestyle. However, in the end, she agreed to let Tamara stay for a while longer because they were old friends and things had been going so well. As the weeks turned into months, Tamara provided no indication whatsoever that she intended to return to the apartment that she had previously occupied. As time went on, Valentina started to experience feelings of exhaustion, frustration, and annoyance. Tamara was beginning to behave as if she was the permanent owner of the space, despite the fact that her tranquil home was no longer her own. The patience that Valentina had was wearing thin, and she came to the realization that she needed to establish a clear boundary. At last, Valentina confronted Tamara toward the end of the month of July in the year 2015. Tamara was informed in a straightforward and authoritative manner that the renovations had been completed for a considerable amount of time and that it was now the appropriate time for her to gather her belongings and return to her own residence. Tamara, on the other hand, became increasingly defensive and flatly refused to leave rather than comprehending the situation and agreeing to leave. As a result of this refusal, the two women engaged in a heated and yelling argument among themselves. They yelled at each other for hours, releasing the frustration and anger that had been building up over the course of years. Despite the fact that the fight had come to an end, Tamara continued to refuse to pack her bags. Over the course of the subsequent few days, the apartment was filled with a heavy and unsettling silence. The two women did not communicate with one another in any way, did not make eye contact with one another, and did not even bother to be in the same room together. Suffocating tension pervaded the cramped apartment that was so small. On the morning of July 23rd, the silence was finally broken when another argument broke out over dirty cups that were found in the kitchen sink. Within a short period of time, this situation quickly escalated back to Tamara leaving, and she finally agreed to pack her bags within a few days. In order to commemorate the occasion, she agreed to prepare Valentina's preferred salad. Instead of that, she went to a pharmacy, purchased some sleeping pills, and then crushed them up and mixed them into the dressing. Following her consumption of the entire salad, Valentina quickly passed out. Tamara discovered her lying on the ground at 2 o'clock in the morning. She used a borrowed hacksaw to dismember her body while she was still alive, but unconscious. She did this while she was still alive. Due to the fact that she had a weakness for human lungs, she carefully removed Valentina's lungs in order to consume them, and then she boiled her head on the stove. The remaining parts of the body were placed in bags and then dumped in a nearby lake or forest over the course of dozens of distinct trips. After a period of 4 days, a couple who were out walking their dog discovered her body by the lake. The authorities were able to identify Valentina and proceeded to the apartment where they discovered Tamara to be completely uninterested. During their search of the house, they discovered a magic book, blood, and a hacksaw. Additionally, they discovered a diary that detailed 14 ritualistic killings. After Tamara admitted her guilt, she was given a sentence of life in prison. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's episode, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have an entire playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?